II, we had the most money, we had the most power, and it became clear that the United States was calling the shots. What the United States empire did functionally was to make room for globalization. Now, that process also happened to be corrupting. The military-industrial complex grew and it never stopped growing. So what allowed it to produce so many weapons of war that, made for victory on the beaches of Normandy and in the Pacific never went away. The empire had to continue to contrive conflicts to feed that war machine. This massive imperial apparatus has just grown and grown and grown, but it can't be sustained.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Max Borders, a futurist, entrepreneur, and author of After the Collapse, where he details the many factors that are leading to America's collapse and what an ideal society would look like after. This is an extremely insightful conversation I hope you guys enjoy. Remember, if you do, please leave this video a like and subscribe, or if you're on Spotify, make sure to follow and leave us a 5-star review. Let's get into it. Is power inherently corrupting?
Is power inherently corrupting? In a population, yes. In an individual, no. Not necessarily. But power tends to concentrate in individuals or in small groups. Whether you're talking about the iron law of oligarchy, which in many respects is a testament to people who are high performers. But it doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to count on someone who's virtuous. And in fact, our social system here in the United States, representative government, as it has evolved from the constitutional order, selects for sociopaths. Now, I hate to say that. I am a huge fan of the Constitution, and I'm even a bigger fan of the Declaration of Independence. That is American jingoism at its finest in certain ways. But I also see the patterns of civilizations as they rise and as they fall, as you get special interest accreting around certain things, where money and power work in an unholy alliance. That stuff starts to be corruptive. We're seeing it right now, laid bare. And the question is it going to be able to, are we going to be able to push back against those concentrations of power and money, especially right in the middle of their coital bed, which is Washington, D.C. But is it inherently, is power inherently corrupting? I would say, because we're dealing with probabilities in a population, yes. Because those who are the most drawn to power are usually the least virtuous.
One of the reasons I asked that question, especially right off the bat, is that that's kind of one of the, especially if we were to look at political divides on the left, is a common talking point, in that the more systemic power that someone's able to get, the more they're just going to naturally be corrupted. And that's why in a lot of ways, especially anarchism, another really interesting political philosophy, is that you can't necessarily trust any type of centralized power. But I don't know. I mean, the reason I kind of wanted to have that discussion off the bat with that is that centralized power can be good, but it feels like when there's too many dynamics, then that opens the door for corruption. When you look at especially money in politics, if you look at just the way there's so much bureaucracy in federal government, like that's kind of where that dynamic shifts. And then I think you bring up an interesting point as well, is that the opportunity for power attracts a certain type of individual. So I guess, what are certain mechanics that should be weighed in terms of deeming who should be able to have the power within any governmental system or, leadership of a group of people?
Well, certainly there's the interpersonal. I might look at you and you say, oh, I want to run for office. I want to do right by my constituents and by the American people. And I can try to do my best to determine whether you're a virtuous person, whether you're a person of principles. Now, I also know that you're going to be thrown into a matrix of incentives. Let's say you run for Congress, right? And if you run for Congress, you're going to face different incentives. To survive as a politician means you have to make trade-offs. quite literally, horse trades with other members of Congress and other special interests. Now, you might not be the kind of person who wants to horse trade on behalf of enriching yourself, like many of these politicians do. But you might be the kind of person who says, in order for me to stay in office and do a little bit of marginal good, I'm going to have to make certain kinds of sacrifices and trade-offs with those others in this incentive system here. And when you start doing that, you start selling your soul, whether you want to or not, because you think, I've got to be in this for the long term. So I tend to look at things at the system level, not at the individual level, because what we might think of as a virtuous person, and people have different ideas of what the good is, but what we might think of as a virtuous person is likely to be mangled up in a system like this. And of course, you know, who's virtuous in Congress? I mean, I have a couple. I'd say, you know, that's not a bad egg. The Thomas Masseys, for example. But otherwise, it's like Thomas Massey looks around himself in horror and sees the dynamics and knows that he's quite vulnerable to those dynamics because there's always somebody who's out to get you. And he has to persuade that his constituencies, many of whom want him to just bring home the bacon to that district, that he's good for America, not just good for that population. So virtue is an important feature, but in centralized systems, especially representative systems, not ideal. So we have to start thinking about how do we reprogram the system? How do we start making the dynamics such that there are more opportunities, and I can talk about this in greater detail in a moment, but the basic gist of the idea is how do you make for competition? Whether that's competition among jurisdictions or competition in the digital cloud. One example might be, you know, it's a good old tested one, but Bitcoin, okay? A lot of your folks might not like Bitcoin. It's a proof of concept. There may be something that replaces it that's better and has other properties that end up causing that currency to win out. But just take the example for a moment. The idea that there would be any kind of alternative that is a hybrid of a digital commodity and a digital asset. Originally, in its conception, it was supposed to be digital cash, an alternative to the dollar. That was unheard of for most of my life, anyway. And now we have this like, okay, whether or not I am comfortable with the volatility of a digital commodity / asset like Bitcoin, at the very least, it is an option, and I can opt into it by trading my U.S. fiat dollars for that digital currency, for that Bitcoin. So suddenly now we have competition, markets and money, just like we can start to see what it might be like to have markets in government or markets in governance. Well, we see it every day. I hope I'm not blowing it for you, but you're based here in Texas. We're sitting here in Texas.
No, you're good. We say it all the time.
All right. And who all's coming into Texas every day from where? Mostly California, because the institutional substrate in Texas is in many ways superior to that of California. We don't even have to ask what that substrate is. We don't even have to ask what the properties of the California system are. It could be anything. It could be a black box. But we know that millions and millions of people are coming from California and moving to Texas. In my home state of North Carolina, they're coming from New York to North Carolina. And the Californians are coming too, by the way, to North Carolina. But it's like, and it's not to say that North Carolina or Texas has the perfect set of institutions, but the rules are such that they give rise to more social benefit to any given person who moves there. Otherwise, why would they move it? Because ain't everybody moving for the weather from California. It's just about perfect, until the fires happen. So you start to see what I mean. If we think at the system level, and that's not to say, and I'm very much about practicing the virtues, and I do hope we get a chance to talk about this in our conversation later. But as a starting point based on what you just asked, you got to think of matters at the system level, which is more or less about decentralizing power, which amounts to giving more opportunities for people to vote with their feet, vote with their boats, or vote with their Hondas or their U-Hauls. Because in so doing, you get what is known as, and this is a fancy term, jurisdictional arbitrage, right? Mm-hmm. The arbitrage is, hey, this is better over here. I'm going to benefit from making this move, just from making this move. And the more you can have markets and governance, the less likely it is for power to be concentrated. Now, that's not to say that we don't have a problem known as Washington, D.C. It is a cancer on the backs of the people. But at least the example of California to Texas or New York to North Carolina gives you an example of at least that those dynamics are possible. You see what I mean?
No, absolutely. And I do want to discuss kind of the macro systems or the federal level here in a sec. But, a follow-up question with that would be, why is there then, and this is a common complaint if you go to Austin or here, Dallas, wherever, is that a California comes there for some of the reasons that you listed, more quote unquote freedom. And yet they tend to bring their voting patterns, their ideologies with them as well. So although they're running away from the system that they may think is broke, they bring all the things that broke it with them to this new area. So why do you think that is? If they can acknowledge the reason they're moving is because they're in a broken system, why do they want to continue to move that broken system to, their new?
Yeah, it is a problem. I think there is a lagging indicator. I think, and I'm not going to sit here and be rah-rah Trump or Trump administration, because we've got a long way to go to see what these folks do and how this works. But I will say there has been what is known as the vibe shift, the sea change. And I know a lot of people who are defectors from certain states who have shifted their outlooks. And it's a lagging indicator from their moving sometimes. But it's like, and it's not everybody. Some just bring their shitty voting. Excuse my mouth, but
you're good.
That's exactly what it is. And they want more of what left their state a husk, and they don't even realize it. But not always. So I think there is a kind of a cultural catch-up that is a lagging indicator behind these interstate migration patterns. Interestingly enough, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but in the Constitution there is, and this is one of the most interesting things about this. If you take three states that are losing the most population, it'd be California, New York, and Illinois. Interestingly, the monies that were the federal largesse during the last 4 years that was rained on the states accrued most to those three states in terms of assistance to migrants who were asylum seekers and so on, using that app. You remember the app?
Yep.
So you have all these people coming from different countries. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter at all. It just needed to be bodies. Well, why is that? And some would say, because they want to eventually get to a place where they feel a sense of obligation to vote in elections for those who were their liberators, for those who let them in the door. Maybe. That might or might not ever happen. It has happened historically where you've had, I think it was the Reagan administration, where you had amnesties for illegal migrants. But in the Constitution, we have the census and this idea of apportionment. And what apportionment says is, hey, the number of congressional seats you have depends on the census. They needed bodies. Now, go back to who was losing bodies, the 3 states that were losing bodies, California, New York, and Illinois. If you want to prevent them from losing seats, you better get more bodies to replace them in those states. So there's a different dynamic there too. It's not just that the people who have left their states a husk are moving into certain states and turning them purple from red, say, like Texas. Mm-hmm. Texas is starting to become much more purple, much closer.
It's crazy.
Right? Whereas Florida is not. And that's an interesting phenomenon. That's some of the vibe shift, the sea change, oh my gosh, this administrative apparatus in this state is just, life is better, right? So it would seem. Now, I'm talking to you as if I love voting in elections. I'm really kind of hostile to it because it is like it's like a slow feedback loop. You need tight feedback loops in order to get
data.
Better, accurate data, better change. So some of this stuff is just me pulling speculation out of my behind. But at the end of the day, it's interesting when the Biden administration started, and suddenly it was like, we're going to tear down the wall that was being constructed. We're going to reverse all this stuff, and we're going to let all these people in the door. It was, I would submit, more than any reason. Of course, you're going to have people who are crying crocodile tears for migrants, and we should be sympathetic to the plight of people who just want to make their lives better. No doubt about it. But at the end of the day, that's not what motivated that party. What motivated that party was apportionment. They were going to lose power in Congress, period, paragraph.
I've never heard that before, but that makes all the sense in the world. I mean, especially too, and this is actually probably a good time to introduce the listeners to kind of more the general idea behind your philosophy. But yeah, I mean, the idea of especially the, two-party system, but they're always focused on maintaining kind of that statewide and nationwide power. So a lot of the main decisions they're making aren't necessarily, even though they'll say it's for the good of the people or, comes from a place of empathy, it's oftentimes making sure that they maintain their own power in one way or another.
It's a mask. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess bringing it kind of full circle, this would probably be a good time to introduce the viewers into, what your philosophy is and kind of the way that you look at centralized versus decentralized systems. And then from there, I think it'd be great to, carry it back to the start of the country and, where a lot of that kind of stemmed from.
Absolutely. Well, we can end there or we can start there, because I would say that probably the crux of my personal philosophy, or if you could say, I see it as holistic, and man, I wish we had a lot more time for that, but that's going to be multiple volumes that I hope to write or have written already. You see this stuff strewn throughout. But if it gets down to really just the essence, I would say that a good starting point, a sense of mission, and I mean mission in the sense of what we all rally around in siblinghood, or what we all rally around, is one goal. And that one goal is captured by one word, and that's consent. Consent of the governed. Okay, so you have this great passage in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's masterpiece, right? So he had some help, but you've got this idea of the consent of the governed. You got this idea that if all of this, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all that stuff we do remember from the Declaration, what we, with the hot dogs and the fireworks and the 4th of July, if it does get mentioned, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you think of those as being rights, some of us do, and then if your government is not providing for those rights, you have a right to alter or abolish it based on this notion of the consent of the governed. And that implies we don't grant our consent. It's very anarchist. It's very anarchist. It's almost like You mentioned anarchism before, and I have a lot of anarchist sympathies. I consider myself an asymptotic anarchist. It's like, I don't build sky castles. I don't build crazy ways of, it's like, oh, this ideal world and we do this. And I certainly tell stories to try to overcome failures of one's imagination. But I also know that we live in the real world with powerful players everywhere, with people who don't share my sympathies, share my politics, share my ideology, whatever. So we have to think about, how do we make directionally moves towards the idea that you get to opt into your own system of governance? Because we all need rules. It's not to say we don't need rules. It's to say that we don't need rulers. And that's what Jefferson said. No, we don't need a single ruler. We need to fashion a situation where we have competition between and among rule sets and rulers. And of course, the Constitution, imperfect as it has been, was an approximation at forging that into a republic. So I'm not trying to wear my tri-cornered hat, and celebrate the 4th of July. But what I'm trying to do is just zone in on this idea of consent. Because when we go back to thinking about it in terms of systems, consent means you have choices. You consent to something or not, or something versus another choice. And when you get two choices, that means competition. And when you get competition, you get decentralization. It might not be much decentralization, but it's something. It is, at the very least, if I have the choice to go over here, if you don't treat me right, then I'm going to go over here. And that dynamic starts to play itself out in terms of what we might call subversive innovation. And I'll come back to subversive innovation in a moment.
So let me ask then, because this will be in the title, and those familiar with your work as well will kind of hear about, after the collapse or the collapse of the American empire. We've had numerous, whether it's CIA agents saying that, we have China on our back door, or, economists that have highlighted the increasing debt. A number of things are going against the quote unquote American empire at this point. And I think you do a really good way of kind of highlighting that we are edging towards the collapse. So can you kind of align that as well in terms of why your belief system would indicate that that's kind of where the American empire may be moving towards?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many answers to that question. But let me just sort of talk about a few. One is that we've seen it over and over again. It's real simple. Whether it's from the British Empire, the costs of maintaining the British Raj in India, in Africa, and elsewhere in the Commonwealth, it just became too costly, particularly after World War II when Churchill and the British were fighting the Nazis. So it's like, okay, we can no longer afford this. It's no longer profitable to be this way. And I think we have this tendency to self-flagellate about colonialism and empire. It had its own culture and values that we need to sort of look at and respect. And certainly I don't appreciate it. But it's like, yes, it was bad that the British colonized the world and maintained an empire, because there were people who lived in those places who probably didn't want them there. And yet there were some places from like a utilitarian perspective that were clearly improved. After the Opium Wars, for example, in Hong Kong became the most resplendent gem on the planet due to basically benign neglect and a great port harbor and really smart people, and it just became this awesome place. And that was a kind of a spillover effect from the British Empire. But also, the British Empire, everywhere it held sway in the world, it abolished slavery. Right? Can you imagine how many human souls were lifted out of slavery because of the existence of the British Empire? So we can't just say, oh, empire always bad, empire always bad. Likewise for the United States. After World War II, we had the most money, we had the most power, and it became clear that the United States was calling the shots. what the United States empire did functionally was to make room for globalization. Now, that process also happened to be corrupting. The military-industrial complex grew, and it never stopped growing after World War II. So what allowed it to produce so many weapons of war that, made for victory on the beaches of Normandy and in the Pacific never went away. And so it's like the empire had to continue to contrive conflicts to feed that war machine. And I bet just about every one of your soldiers see that, even though they're committed Marines or Army guys or whatever.
I don't think I've had a single come on that say when they look back on, especially the previous, Iraq, Afghanistan, that look back and say we were there for the right reasons. I don't think I've had a single one. I mean, they have viewpoints, obviously, that differ. Some say there was still good that was there. Some are completely black-pilled against it. But there's definitely never been anyone that's come on and said everything checked out, we were good to go. So,
well, and it's funny. I'm so happy about this fact. And man, I can shoot a gun, but that's about it at a range. Mm-hmm. And these guys, these badasses, they reach out to me all the time reading my work, and they are so into it. And I have so much respect for them, and they have so much respect for my work. And I think it's because, going back to this idea of mission, that's why they got into it. Because somebody told them about this idea of freedom that they were meant to protect, and that it was enshrined in the Constitution, and that's what they swore an oath to. Mm-hmm. Now it's like, man, you guys sold me a bill of goods. You sent me over there to watch my buddy get blown up by an IED, and it was for what? For some bizarre domino strategy for the Middle East where you're going to try to overturn a series of sort of dictatorships and caliphates? Come on. It's just bad strategy for one thing. It hasn't worked out at all. It's cost us a fortune. We're now in a situation of $36 trillion debt. And a lot of people are not willing to acknowledge that a lot of that is because of all these wars we've been conducting. Feeding that war machine, the military-industrial complex, and of course, the soft power that grew around it, which is, of course, USAID and so on. And then the spooks and the CIA and stuff like that. This massive imperial apparatus has just grown and grown and grown, but it can't be sustained. You can look at Rome.
It was literally going to be the next question.
Every man has to talk about Rome.
Yeah,
right?
And the comparisons are scary. I mean, when you look at it from a timeline standpoint, obviously they had a couple more thousand years, but in terms of if we looked at a roadmap of how everything's moving, and I think you're about to highlight this, it's oddly similar.
Yes. I mean, right down to the dilution of the money. Mm. They would have coins going in the treasury, and they would have round-the-clock folks there dedicated to replacing whatever precious metal was that with something less valuable, creating alloy tokens, sending them back out into the world. But over hundreds of years, this process meant that these coins were valueless. I mean, quite literally, dilution of value, not just printing coins or like we have the printing press. And every time Congress passes one of these bloated bills, the Federal Reserve says, okay, well, we got to find a way to pay for it. Printer, money printer, money printer. And then we all sit around and go, why can't I afford anything anymore? Why are the prices going up? Too many dollars chasing too few goods. Mm-hmm. So this happens in Rome. This happens in, what was the...
Britain.
Old man brain. Well, Britain certainly, but even more than that, the Imperial Germany before the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's just gone right out of my mind. But Weimar Germany, they had a terrible problem with inflation. And you get these countries, they don't always have to be empires. You just get countries with power structures where they want to continue to centralize power. They want to continue to expand their influence in their countries. and they print money to do it because that's the only choice they have. Governments don't really create value. I mean, arguably, there are things that governments do to create value, but net value, almost never.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the other items too that you highlight, like especially looking at Rome, is that when an empire takes on the world, or in a lot of ways, kind of military industrial complex, and the idea of being you need to constantly feed that machine, you overstretch. When you look at Rome, it was the biggest empire the world's ever seen, and yet that is almost what led to its collapse because it became too overstrong. And obviously, it's different dynamics today. I mean, the U.S. does have soldiers pretty much everywhere in the world, but we're not necessarily consistently, fighting conflict or anything like that. It's more so the idea of it, the idea that there always has to be some type of conflict where that money's going, the idea that there's consistent soldiers everywhere, that there has to be a new enemy. And I feel like, again, that's another huge similarity that we've had soldiers on this podcast point out. Our version of the Roman Empire is in that same way. We have inflationary pressures at home, and we're extending far beyond our own borders to the point that, the centralized institution is starting to kind of crack at the foundations, and it has been for a while.
Yeah.
Where do you, I guess looking back into it, so which one of these pressures would you indicate is the biggest towards America's potential collapse?
So let me go back for a moment to the punchline about, and then I'll try to answer that because it's related to this idea about, we said the British Empire did some good with abolishing slavery worldwide. The American Empire, we said, in exchange for the world's reserve currency, Bretton Woods Accord, we're going to provide sort of like a global military constable to keep trade routes and sea lanes open so we can all trade with each other. And I think this has largely been good. I mean, some people are going to say, yeah, we've gutted our manufacturing. Our manufacturing is still quite strong. It's just relative to other parts of the economy, it's not grown as fast. And certainly certain kinds of manufacturing we have offshored. That's not all because of globalization. Some of that is because we just have high taxes and bad institutions in a lot of places. And these CEOs said this is just cheaper to do it offshore. And it becomes a rational decision that guts the manufacturing base. They're playing a little bit of a dangerous economic game to try to beef up our manufacturing and onshore some things. And I think there are some, the Trump administration, for example, has some credible things that they are thinking about in terms of national security with respect to building chipsets and things that go in phones and stuff like that. Like you don't want these to be completely at the behest of China, whether that's chipsets from Taiwan, which is surrounded by China and they're being threatened by them, or Chinese providing, steel for our military equipment can just on a dime say, nope, goodbye, right? And then we'd be sitting ducks. So there's a lot of dynamics there that I understand that, repatriating industries is a good idea from not pure economic theory. From pure economic theory, if you could operate in a world where you didn't have all these military threats and you didn't have all this other kind of shenanigans going on, it's probably best just for everybody to trade for mutual benefit and we grow rich together. But we could argue about that another day, and half the Trump administration probably would argue with me on that. Nevertheless, that was the idea after World War II for the United States empire. It grew up to become the world constable so that everybody could trade with each other. And the richer we all become together, the less likely we are to be bellicose and to militarize. And that wasn't wrong. In a lot of ways, the world has been safer compared to the 20th century and prior centuries than in any other way. The world constable thing worked for a while. But now we're back in a multipolar world. Now we're back starting to pull in. We're starting to lose the world's reserve currency status. And things are changing. So what does that mean? It's also become as that guy would say, the rent is too damn high, right?
Yeah.
To keep this empire up. Whether that's paying soldiers to be in whatever the fuckistan, or to pay these people to, put Sesame Street in Iraq. It's just like at a certain point, we're facing either sovereign default, despite having the world's reserve currency, or we're facing a lot more rapid inflation. And that hurts the poorest people in the United States first and hardest. So now, you asked me about, I want to make sure I get it right. So would you repeat the question, the dynamics of dissolution of empire?
Yeah, and I guess currently what's going to be the biggest indicator of an American collapse?
Yeah.
Or as we know America.
We're starting to see signs. One is just culture. Starting to see a culture of decadence. People having the more admiration for, this is not necessarily my idea, but I think it's right. And I'm not saying little decadence now and then never hurt anybody, right? Let's have some fun. But just a culture of decadence, where decadence is just a general fraying of the social fabric, a general dissolution of communities, tight communities, whether that be churches or mutual aid associations, where people seem to care more about being on Instagram than they do about being together in the same room, loving each other and looking after each other, where they replace general sense of practice of the virtues with virtue signaling. I'm a good person because I believe in this political party, or, I'm okay with whatever the, social justice fundamentalism point of the day is, whether that's, I'm okay with people tearing down buildings and lighting fires in the streets because of, magnifying some problematic police interaction, 2020.
Yeah.
Or I want to fight for children's rights to be who they are, whatever gender expression they want to identify with, blah, 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 come what may, no matter what the parents think. These culture war things are connected intimately to these political dynamics, these large-scale political dynamics, and they're related.
Yeah.
That sense of connectedness that we might have as a community or as a people is being lost and is being fractured. And as a people become fractured, they become less interested in what it means to be an American and pay taxes for this effort or that effort. And yet we do. So that leads me to another dynamic, which is the growth of the administrative state, which has its own, it has its own immune system. We're seeing it right now, and it's, I want to say that sort of the optics around, Elon and DOGE going in and turning over all these stones is off-putting to some people. But I think on net, it's like, if you've been watching this show, this rise of the administrative state for most of my life. I was born in 1973 when Nixon was booted, right? We've always had an administrative state that was growing, and it got rolled back a little bit in different phases. Ironically, Clinton and Reagan. But beyond that, it's just swelling and swelling and swelling, and you can't swell forever. It's just kind of common sense. Empires are going to fall. So you get the welfare warfare state where people make their allegiances historically to either welfare, warfare, or both instead of local community, instead of kinship ties, instead of church. And I'm not particularly religious, but I see the value in people who come together in their temples, in their churches, to help one another, to weave the social safety net together. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That cultural and spiritual dimension of people operating in siblinghood, in fraternity or sorority. I like to call it siblinghood because it's non-gendered. Man, that's the good stuff. That's the stuff that America used to have, and we don't have it anymore. Instead, we've outsourced our sense of responsibility to distant capitals. And we constantly get scared into doing so. Oh my gosh, there are going to be people dying in the streets, and how are people going to eat, and how this and how that, how are babies going to get their milk and their injections and this and that, right? Right now, that's what we're hearing. Right? Or China's going to get us, or Al-Qaeda is going to get us, war on terror, whatever it is the cause du jour in the welfare warfare state constantly wants to keep us afraid so that we're distracted and we outsource our responsibilities to these power players, the administrative state in Washington, D.C., and we think, and then they tell us, oh, but we have a democracy, right? That, oh, you just get out there and vote, and if you want to change things, that's what you can do. And every 4 years or so, we cry our teardrop in the ocean and we expect the tide to turn, and it never does. Mm-hmm. That's what voting is. Now, this time around seemed different. Will it be? I can't say. But one thing is clear. There is an array of predators and parasites and their sympathizers who are out there right now crying the blues about all that's going on in Washington, about the administrative state, the attempt on the part of the executive to roll it back.
Yeah, I want to get to the Trump admin here in a sec, but I think you brought up a really interesting point that I did want to circle back to, which is the idea of, I think we've seen an acceleration of, in terms of political allegiancy or political thought in both the far left and the far right. If you go on a place like X now, it's kind of really become, a fascist haven. And if you go to I'm not saying for, some people get called fascists on there just because they have like conservative views. I don't mean like that. I mean, genuine, saying,
everything I don't like is fascist is not the same thing as what you're talking about.
Yeah, like and I'm sure people know who I'm talking about, and then you get extreme on the far left as well. And it seems like that's two avenues that have increasingly been growing. And, one of the things people like to say is, it's because of this party or Trump but realistically, and I think you were kind of cueing this in, is that it's the failures that the system keeps bringing them that pushes people into some of those darker corners of kind of political thought. Because when they look at Washington, D.C., the expectation is you're supposed to be having my best interest in heart, and yet my best interest is always put on the sideline. So you're kind of going to go one direction or the other. You're going to go far left, thinking that, well, if we increase the power there, then more can get done, and then I can, the billionaires or whoever can pay their whatever the arguments are there. If you're on the far right, you start saying, well, we got to get rid of these, leeches and, some of the more racist tropes that might be there. And that's what it opens the door for.
It becomes the Molotov cocktail crowd versus the Tiki Torch crowd.
Yep.
And they both aren't worth a damn. They're both authoritarian. They're just flavors of authoritarian. It's like the brown shirts and the red shirts in Europe in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. It's like you're creating a choice set. You're even further polarizing people, and you're trading a choice set between shit and vomit. Mm-hmm. That's no kind of choice. And this is really why, you asked me initially about my philosophy, is that we have to build what I call an empire of the mind. And an empire of the mind, in this particular instance, really starts with this idea of the consent of the governed, about local community, returning to local, decentralization is not just about power. It's also about local empowerment, about looking your community members in the eyes and helping people out and really like practicing the virtues that are involved in a community, just like you would practice violin or yoga or MMA. Like, in order to get good at it, you have to do it. But we've outsourced it. And the more we outsource that sensibility online, the more it seems like, well, I've just got to be the opposite of that, which is crazy. I got to be this kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. And so they have no moorings. They have no principled commitment to the practice of the virtues.
Yeah. And I feel like, too, going back to that, trope of the end of the empire, you look at the end of the Russian Empire, led to the Soviet Union, end of the German Empire, led to the rise of Nazi Germany. None of these hardcore political ideologies ever stem from a normalized society. It always is at the end of that empire when, essentially everything's going wrong. And I guess that would be the fear that a lot of, people people would think, is that since we are at the tail end, we see those bubbles increasing. What does that mean? Like, what's next? If we look in 5-10 years as it gets more and more extreme, and yet there's no shifts at the federal level, what comes there? And I guess that would bring me back to the idea of America's collapse. Does it go out on a whimper or does it go out on a bang?
Great question. I mean, first of all, I'll say, I just throw up my hands and say, I don't know. I think the more likely scenario is that it goes out with a whimper, but it could very well go out with a bang, because sometimes complex systems don't behave in the way you want them to. And our economy is a complex system. That being said, I think the most powerful people in the world who get that we're in the last miles, the last days, years, days metaphorically, years probably, realize that there's no escaping inflation. And when you start to get inflation, it innervates, it immiserates, it creates no value. Right now, we're going to soon see 25% of our entire federal budget going to debt service. And that's turned geometric already. In other words, service on the debt. I don't want to get into boring economic stuff because I don't want your listeners to be like, no, I'm out of here. I got to go to the bathroom, whatever. I got to get a snack. But suffice it to say is when you get to this point, when the debt service starts to compound, it turns geometric. So looking on a graph from your perspective, it's like this. Mm-hmm. And more of the budget just gets completely cannibalized to go to the debt. So what was already very low net value is now negative. It's just tearing into the value. And so that's not good. And yet the only feasible way to address that is inflation. Because if your debt is denominated in a certain number of dollars, and you can at least pay for debt because it's retroactive. It's you're looking into the past, kind of. So you can cut this out if it really is that damn boring, but I'm trying to figure out how to put a period on the end of this very long paragraph. We're not going to be able to avoid inflation. And even though there are all these politicians that say, we got to fight inflation and these blah, blah Democrats are causing the inflation, man, that ship has sailed so long ago. I mean, yes, the Democrats most likely contributed more to it than the Republicans in the last 10 years. Doesn't matter. You can't just say, we're going to get elected and we're going to resolve this in a year, because you're not. And it may be the undoing of whoever would be the successor to the Trump administration on the right. So I am not hopeful about this. Let me rephrase that. I am hopeful. I want to be optimistic. I want to think that the doctors, some of these wizards in Washington, or the doctors in the surgical theater can save the patient. But I don't think that's very likely. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to see something like a physical collapse, and along with that, some of the cultural and other problems that go with it. I think we're going to see a collapse in those ways too, because collapse is multidimensional.
Yeah, so I guess we'll stick on this too, because I do want to bring up what a bang may look like. But
okay,
with the idea of a whimper, we're talking this, a 5-10 year process, I would imagine, in terms of the time we're looking at, maybe even to 20 years. But is it more of, when we say that simply American power continues to diminish across the globe, and then we have an actor like China rise up and is able to kind of take the forefront as the economic superpower? I guess what does the whimper look like, or do we move in a direction similar to Germany post World War I, where hyperinflation, when inflation takes over, it opens the door for a change?
Yeah, I mean, you could get some kind of debt jubilee, and at that point, you have to return to fiscal solvency and then power, not having that being fueled by debt. I don't know what that looks like, and I'm not an expert in that regard, but I think it's a distant possibility. In terms of China, we think about a lot of this stuff in terms of complex systems. What China has going for it, and this is changing fast due to demographics, China has going for it a population, a big population. Happily, there's a big population right next door, and it's called India. But we'll set that aside for a moment. China's population means it's going to be an economic powerhouse relative to the United States for a while. But in terms of the way the Chinese economy runs, there's too much government involvement and there's too much hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Hierarchies tend to collapse in on themselves. This is what we're seeing sort of right now with the federal government too. As the economy becomes more complex and the regulatory state tries to intervene in complex system, the system creates codependencies, and those codependencies can lead to collapse, information problems, right? When you have information going up and down chains of command, for example, this is another reason that Rome fell. You are unable to process all the information, whereas in peer-to-peer network systems, the information flows more readily where it needs to. I know this sounds really abstract, but just the point in saying this is China is too top-down, right? Mm-hmm. Too much of a command and control kind of society. And a lot of what they have been able to do, as we've been coasting on the fumes of debt, they have too in a lot of ways, but also coasting on the fumes of export-led growth. As fewer and fewer countries are able to afford what China's offering, this export-led growth is going to start to back up. And from what I hear, the Chinese don't even have like a real solid profit and loss system. The government's constantly bailing them out for stupid stuff, right? Bailing out industries or nationalizing the industries. That's not sustainable either. Also, the Chinese aren't terribly happy with the CCP all the time, and just depending on where you are, there's corruption in certain regions and things like that. So they have problems just like we do. They could very well be on the cusp of a collapse scenario as well, but that might necessitate them trying to attack now or never, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so it's so hard to anticipate these kind of things. I think we should always have a vigilant eye toward China and what they're doing. And the collapse scenarios that are due to mostly to our internal factors, I think make it kind of unavoidable as well. So it's like, who's going to peter out faster, the Chinese or the Americans? Mm-hmm. Who's the next rising power? I couldn't say. If the Chinese were to to really, really liberalize their economy rapidly, they could be it. So you had all these fantastic American companies, but you didn't really have this great military industrial complex yet. That was a process that happened late in the war, where it's like all of a sudden over the course of a year or two, there was this massive adaptation effort that sort of transformed current industries. You know, Ford, I want to say it's Ford Motor Company started making, you know, airplane fuselages and all kinds of stuff. Whatever I get wrong on the details, we know that there was this massive industrial policy that retooled the entire American economy toward the war effort. The problem is the war, our enemies in a sense, made us into everything we hated, right? Because the real definition of fascism is state-directed control over corporations. People, you know, use the term fascism all the time. Fascist this, fascist that. And what they're really talking about is those old meanies. I don't like those old meanies who want to attack other people. But fascism, as you know, Mussolini and his intellectual forebears actually gave it to us was, and by the way, FDR admired this about Mussolini before they went to war, is the idea of a strong central government guiding industrial policy. So we were a relatively free market economy before that. Before we had just gotten out of the Great Depression, don't forget. So there was all kinds of industrial policy already going on. And they're looking at Europe and they're seeing the Italians, they're seeing the Germans, and they're saying industrial policy works. And they're gearing up for war. And they'll say, well, we'll do that too. And then we geared up for war because Europe was at war and we're going to get dragged into it. Suddenly we created an incentive system where mama money and papa power got into the same coital bed and gave birth to something odious. And yet it was a necessary evil at the time, but it never went away. Like I said, Eisenhower, in that last speech, Ike said, you got to watch out for the technocratic elite. They're taking over. And you got to watch out for the military-industrial complex. He coined the term. And boy, was he ever right. He was absolutely spot on with that warning. And we are still living with that legacy. Winning World War II cost us so much. It's cost me my entire life. And as I said, I was born in 1973. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, I've never not seen that. But your original question is a good one. As compared to what? What are we going to do when we get a power like China that threatens? What are we going to do if we get another power, you know, a rogue state or a rogue actor that threatens threatens our one of our allies, close allies? Well, the more we allow ourselves to get pulled into those conflicts, the more we get pulled into industrial policy that's not a decentralized market economy. We turn into the very thing we hate, which is fascists, state-controlled corporations, and that's economic fascism. You add the nationalism piece, and you got a pretty full picture of what fascism actually was, what Mussolini celebrated, and what FDR admired. So now it's like, okay, we got to overcome failures of imagination about centralized control. What does that look like? And I'll do it quickly. There was back in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, there was a civilization called the Hanseatic League. Maybe you've heard of that in history classes or something like that, read about it. But basically, there were these city-states in, the Baltics and Germany, right around the seas, bordering on those seas. Well, these city-states were independent. They had their own decision-making authority. They had their own, their own governance structures and everything, and yet they needed to depend on each other in certain ways, whether it was pirates out on the sea or people who were attacking them. And so they were able to raise their own defense systems, their own armies and so on, their own navies as well, if they were naval powers, naval city-states, bordering the sea. And they were able to coordinate as city-states at scale for these problems. The question is there a decentralized polycentric defense system or structure that is possible? I don't know, but I think it's something that it's worth looking at. I think it's more likely that with such a system you don't get overproduction of defense like we do now. And by overproduction of defense, I mean everything from, do we really need another $1 billion jet or another, $1,500 bolt that goes into the jet? I mean, like, some of this stuff is just absolute highway robbery. So figuring out how to inject market discipline into the system, but also how to coordinate for polycentric defense so that this army knows what this army's doing and they share the same values. So if there's an invader, they can coordinate to, and this has been done over the course of civilizations where you had alliances and stuff. You have to be careful about these kind of alliances, just like we have had to be careful about NATO. Mm-hmm. NATO has been a questionable actor on this issue of Russia and the Ukraine, and we have to acknowledge that, even if we want to go rah-rah underdog Ukraine. Can't really do that, particularly with the United States and the way it's tried to intervene over the years.
So let me ask then, if you look at the EU, which is kind of in its own way decentralized states, but there's more dynamics that go into that. But in general, decentralized states. But it seems like the issue with the EU is that what happens when certain characters are not pulling their own weight. I mean, oftentimes they'll point towards Greece. That's what led to the UK from exiting and all those different things as well. So I guess because it kind of the key worry, and I feel like this would be something that would be a focus point for maybe some of the soldiers that I have on and stuff, that, defense has to be so critical. So how are you going to work around those dynamics as well as that certain actors within the greater system may not be able to pull their weight?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really a lot of ways to think about this. I'll enumerate a couple and admit that you got guests that are far better than I at this kind of stuff. But they'll tell you that there are things that they admire. For example, I want to say the Finnish or the Norwegians, I think it's the Finnish, have one of the most badass militaries. Mm-hmm. It's strong, it's lean. These guys know how to do sort of, cold woodland terrain warfare. They have like super cool special forces.
Their special forces are hyper elite.
Yeah. And it's like, why is that the case? Well, they bordering Russia, which has been a bellicose power in the past. They look at their neighbors to the south, Estonia, the Baltic countries, Lithuania, and so on. And they've seen that the Russians have had imperial ambitions. They're like, we don't want to be a victim of that. So they have a strong incentive to just to beef up. Mm-hmm. I remember Biden making a joke about, what are you going to do about an F-16 with your guns? A couple of rednecks in the woods. What are you going to do about an F-16? As if to say the might of the federal government is going to put you under its thumb, redneck with a gun. And I just think about different rednecks with guns in Afghanistan, after 20 years, turned out the world's greatest superpower. You might not like that fact, but it's true. It's like, the abysmal withdrawal from Afghanistan that was conducted by the Biden administration is a shame and a stain on it. But it also represents 20 years of sunk cost in human blood and treasure. Mm-hmm. And that was done by these not particularly advanced or sophisticated fighters. They were supremely decentralized and adaptive. the Taliban. I mean, wow. Like, you cannot but admire putting up with that kind of imperial might and all that money and technology over that many years. Mm-hmm. It just kind of shows you how flabby the Leviathan has gotten. So if the goat herders and the poppy growers and the, people with 1980s Kalashnikov rifles can run you out of their country after 20 years, what does that say about your entire military industrial complex, about the civilian-led armed forces and so on? It's like, maybe it's time to really rethink this. What does a leaner, meaner, more polycentric system look like? How do we start to look, what are the incentives for, what is the equivalent of our Finnish, special forces? Mm-hmm. I don't know what that looks like, but centralization keeps us from asking those questions. So I paint a picture for you of the Hanseatic League, not to say I have all the answers, because the answers they emerge from these incentives and these forces. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can't anticipate that. But it looks like that this industrial policy idea is kind of outliving its usefulness in this day and age. Things are changing. Warfare is becoming much more decentralized. And so industrial policy, making, battleships and tanks and weapons and all of it being very expensive when we're coasting on the fumes of debt, I just don't see that as being sustainable. And yet, China is a menace.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, the reason I push on it is just because it's an interesting thought experiment, because I do agree. I think, as you push for a decentralized system, I think there's certainly a case. I mean, obviously it was hundreds of years ago, but the country's founding in itself was the 13 colonies coming together, putting together an army to address, the threat at that time. And then it wasn't necessarily right from there into military-industrial complex. There's the argument, of federalism versus anti-federalism. It was really a conversation. So I definitely think there's a possibility for entities in a decentralized system to come together, but then after being able to separate. It's just more for interesting thought, because I'm sure many, hearing this are always going to be concerned on what's on the outside. Like, are we getting too focused on the inside? We need to make sure that we're looking at some of these enemies like a China, like a Russia, who knows, India at some point as they continue to expand. But you did bring up something very interesting as well, Biden mentioning the F-16s. And I think that kind of brings us it's a good roadmap into talking about what happens if we go out with a bang. Because as people continuously get more and more disenfranchised with what the U.S. government offers, what their day-to-day life looks like, the other side of the coin is we get something like a civil war where, all these different entities, far right, far left, start to clash more and more, both on the federal stage and, within the states. So I guess, what does that look like? And from a percentage perspective or your own mindset, how likely do you also see that as a possibility?
Yeah. So I use the metaphor of predators and parasites, right? Predators are those who want to keep power through predatory means, basically. And parasites are those who exist sort of at the public trough in some form or fashion. And both of these are forces that combine together in interesting ways that are really hard to deal with. But once you run out of money, or once you get low enough on funds that you have to start, I guess you call it a sort of like a triage. They're at the center of power. They're going to get the resources first. So then we can imagine a situation, unless you have virtuous people in Washington. And when have we last seen that? I don't know.
Yeah, been a while.
Been a minute. Then you have, and they don't believe they're not virtuous, right? Their vice is to us is their virtue to them. So this is how you create this polarization that we're seeing. One way, it's just a fundamentally different way of looking at things. So I think the way that it goes down is you get a lot of, I hate to say it because I'm just terribly poorly prepared, but you get a lot of preppers and rednecks in the woods with lots of guns, and they know how to use them. And a lot of them are ex-military, and a lot of them are absolutely fed up. And I think you're going to find this within the rank and file as well. So it's not just that they're going to be out there, retired military or whatever, but there are a ton of those. And they believe, generally speaking, in this mission that I described at the outset. I think you're also going to have a class of desperate people, what we might call former parasites. And I'm not trying to disparage poor people. I'm just going to say when you go from 5% unemployment to 10% unemployment to 20% unemployment, you got desperate people out there. They need resources. Mm-hmm. How they get resources is sometimes through desperate means, like crime. Okay? So suddenly now you have a criminal class that has been created by the system, and you got to figure out how to address it. So people at the periphery, normal people, preppers with guns and whatnot, have to start preparing for that as an eventuality. They have to start defending their own houses, their own families, and so on. So there's potential for frictions and conflicts there as well. But on the bright side, so that's a tinderbox that could lead to civil war conditions. If especially among the elites, the parasite class that believe that they are entitled to continue to use us like good little milk cows, mm-hmm. but they turn us into raging bulls. And this is what's happening right now. Right now, we're already at war, but it's a mind war. It's an ideological war to some degree, but it's also just a bunch of people who are fed up. It's not that sophisticated. But these people are absolutely powerful, and we are not giving them credit for just how powerful they are. You know, this DOGE thing could run its course. People with the right amount of, threats, sticks and carrots could start doing things behind the scenes. You just never know. I don't know how this exactly would go down, but if things went with a bang, I think it's to the point at which the lateralization of violent relationships overcomes where certain amount of ordinary citizens make their allegiances with the powerful, and the others make their allegiances with the people. And so then we don't just have a Great Depression, we have conflict over resources. That's a bad state of affairs. That's a very bad state of affairs. And that could that wouldn't end pretty, and I don't know exactly how it would look, but imagine having to have your family members on guard in the backyard just to keep people from stealing your chickens. Mm-hmm. 20% of our people are in poverty all of a sudden. Abject poverty. I'm not talking about currently 15% of people live at or below poverty line as defined by the federal government. But I'm talking like 20% of the population is unemployed instead of 5%. And there is widespread desperation.
Zero income, tons of debt.
Right. And some of these people will not and do not give a rat's ass about rich people, that they've earned their money or whatever. When you got to feed your family, but ordinary people are going to try to defend their families. So you sort of douse that flame, that little bit of tinder that's starting to burn with the flames of ideology, as people start to pick sides and they polarize more, yeah, that's bad news. I hope we never get there. I absolutely hope we never get there. And here's why I do what I do. Do you want me to stop there and let you ask?
Continue.
This is why I do what I do. I think we need a philosophical and spiritual reckoning in this country that's not just about reforming the system. I know I started off by saying that. It's not an either or, it's a both and. At the same time, we need to reconfigure the system around the consent of the governed, going back to the original mission and vision of this country. Around that, we need to build what I call an empire of the mind. And an empire of the mind is a set of beliefs and practices. And I say practice on purpose. Again, just like yoga, just like MMA, just like violin, you got to keep doing it in order to be good at it. And you got to practice with each other to enjoy the social benefits of it. We got to learn how to look after our neighbors again with compassion. We got to learn how to not initiate violence against other people, like ahimsa or like Jesus, right? That love thy neighbor as thyself doctrine is important to practice, but that doesn't mean don't defend yourself and your family. Quite the contrary. We need those good old boys with guns to teach us how to shoot and to learn how to coordinate with each other as a community, because in those conditions. But first and foremost, we need to cohere as a community. And what does that look like? That is about establishing self-sovereignty first. So self, family, community, region, nation, world. It's our agency and our efficacy as we practice the virtues and as we practice becoming better human beings, builders, innovators, and so on. This will radiate out from us. We are in a moment right now where people are excited again about building businesses. People are excited again about trying new things, innovating. That, coupled with this return to the practice of virtues, integrity, right? Show up on time. Just because you found something on your smartphone that, wanted to make you 30 minutes late, and you're like, my fault, right? You're denying someone their time, and that amounts to an opportunity cost. When that aggregates on the whole of society, the integrity of the system starts to be threatened. So integrity is being a person of your word. Like, this is just simple stuff. This is stuff that we all grew up hearing, but we really need to go back to practicing it. We really need to go back to doing it. When you have stewardship, leaving your property and offices better than you found it. Practicing reason, rationality, right? Being keen to seek the truth, come what may, and not tell yourself lies in order to massage your ego or keep your friends or whatever. Relentless pursuit of truth. These virtues, when practiced, nonviolence, integrity, compassion, stewardship, rationality, pluralism, the idea that somebody might be different from you, but you lovingly tolerate what they do, right? Because we ain't all alike. That's just a fact. These virtues cohere, right? And that's part and parcel to building an empire of the mind. You are responsible for practicing all this. I am responsible for practicing all this. Together, when we practice it, we have better communities and better societies. It radiates outward, like the monks in the meditation forest. The cow and the tiger drank next to each other, according to one of the gurus of the ancient Indian myths about ahimsa, radiating peacefulness. There is so much power in these practices. The empire of the mind, we got to download that memeplex first, right? It's not just that we're, flicking through X all day at what the latest What did you hear? Who's Jeffrey Epstein? Blah blah blah. What does my side think about this versus your side? Right, in our filter bubbles, there are these timeless virtues and practices that we have to return to, because it's not just about how we fight an internal enemy that emerges when the shit hits the fan after collapse. It is also, how do we rebuild in the ashes? Or how do we endure it together? How do I make sure that we take care of each other in mutual aid? That forging of siblinghood, forging of fraternity or sorority or both, right? That's what we need. And man, it hit me like a truck in recent years. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. You can see the gray in my hair. But you start to think about, you really miss it when it's gone.
Mm-hmm. So how would you differentiate yourself then from an ideology like anarcho-capitalism, or communism rather? So the idea of like the ideal communist state, where there is no necessarily central government because it's a full communist society and everyone's working for the better of the community. Like, how would you, I guess, what are the positives there? What are the negatives, and how would you differentiate yourself from that?
The difference is probably two or three subtle ways. The first being the institution of property, right? Private property. The idea that someone has a bundle of things that they can do to dispose of or conserve or not their property, to trade it, property being a precondition of trade, is pretty basic to a worldview where we would have rules without rulers, and those rules would include rules around private property, that people can have title to property and dispose of it and trade with it. Those are the bases of building prosperity, right? Just simple. With an anarcho-communist, they're not going to allow that institution to come in. They're going to have things managed as a commons through either through democratic means. This is the Noam Chomsky version, right? Or through a central committee, and this is the Stalinist version. Neither of these works particularly well, but I would say this. Sometimes the Chomsky stuff can work. We see it all the time with the kibbutzim in Israel, right? Mm-hmm. To live on a kibbutz, you share the surpluses. You can export some of the surpluses. But otherwise, you have a situation where communism is possible within the wider, more pluralistic society. So I'm not hostile to anarcho-communism. Do your best. Just don't require that I do that. And that's the problem, and that's the major difference. My fundamental philosophy is about consent and persuasion. Their fundamental philosophy is about compulsion and force. Because if you give someone the choice to choose how they dispose of their property or how they engage in community or conduct their industry, that's the difference. Now, there's a lot of debates about capitalism versus communism, about, well, what about the environmental stuff? And that'll take us too far afield. Mm-hmm. But the basic idea is one system is consent-based, and one system allows for the introduction of institutional rules around property prices, profit and loss, but also community, forming community, of not doing that. So you and I might want to join a commune. It might need to stay small, sub-Dunbar, Dunbar's number being 150 people. Usually after 150 people, things start to go awry. The Amish know this, but they share collectively. So these can work in certain circumstances, and some people might appreciate that. And go with God, you know what I mean? Because there is beauty and power in this kind of community sharing, just as long as you don't try to impose it on a whole of society like Mao did or Stalin did.
So I guess working off of that and going back to, we kind of covered the whimper and the bang. If you know, best guess here, obviously there's just so much that goes into it, but what do you think the end of America's empire, the timeline actually looks like from the current position we sit now? And if really no true changes are made, whether by the Trump admin or the admins to follow?
Man, to be honest, I would be pulling that answer out of my behind. The dynamics are so complicated. I mean, it's sort of like, it's more like being a seer. It's more about thinking through from first principles, even though it's fuzzy or hazy. So, I mean, it can be anywhere from 5 years to 20 years, even more. And in the whimper scenario, it's just like things change, and it's almost, it gets sort of progressively worse, but it's difficult to discern, right? Obviously, in a bang scenario where you have a civil war, you have an attack from a foreign power, or you have just a sudden collapse of the federal government that goes broke, and nobody's buying our bonds anymore, and hyperinflation, and then the emergence of an autocratic power that says we're going to do like the fascists did and reconstitute our economy based on this sort of 1930s mentality. That could happen, but I think what I'm hopeful about is in this era of artificial intelligence, of distributed ledger technologies like blockchain, with this almost global sense of, okay, something has changed. And this was with the election, but it's going deeper and it has reverberations. Now, leave it to the politicians to screw things up. But something has been catalyzed. It is a spirit that is animating people around the world, and that can manifest as something healthy or unhealthy. But let's assume that it can manifest as something healthy. This is where the empire of the mind stuff comes in. Always going back to the timeless virtues, always going back to our practices, where our inner world starts to manifest into our outer world. I know that sounds like woo a little bit, but like...
No, I understand. I mean, it's that the human connection kind of be the most forefront, and what you're highlighting, I think this is maybe we're going to get to, so hopefully, but it's the idea of kind of systems evolution is now humanity, since we're kind of evolving intelligently. We're moving beyond previous systems and expectations that we had to do to be able to be a successful society.
Yeah. And so since settled agriculture, where you had the takers overcoming the makers and taxing them, and that grew into empires, right? We are living in a time where we can, through technology, lateralize our relationships. I wrote a book, it's probably my most successful book, called The Social Singularity. I'd love it if people bought it, but the main point of that book is to say, with technological means, we can begin to lateralize our relationships in ways that cause us to reconfigure society in a decentralized way. So even if there's a collapse over here, an economic collapse over here, it might reconstitute itself or self-organize in an interesting new way that we couldn't anticipate. Mm-hmm. So it could be that a collapse turns into a reconfiguration of society that happens almost without us noticing. That's my hope. I call that the social singularity. So the singularity is the point in the future where the technological singularity, it's like you extrapolate Moore's law into the future where computer processing power gets so smart and the AI gets so good that it wakes up. Yeah. And the AIs are all smarter than us, and they become agentic. They become capable of decision making, and they don't need us anymore. Maybe, you know, and that's a scary thought. People have spent a lot of time worrying about that, fretting about it, especially with AI getting as good as it is. But in parallel to that, Bitcoin did something. It changed the world in fundamental ways, and people just don't realizing it yet. And people might say, well, Bitcoin isn't worth a damn. It's too this, it's too that. It doesn't matter. We now have a whole ecosystem of cryptocurrency tokens that represent different technological properties that allow for lateralization. So just decentralized finance, right? Being able to get a loan without an intermediary, a bank or a government or whatever. Being able to do X without an intermediary is that lateralization I'm talking about. Once that turns us from a more of a hierarchy into a network, it could be game over. That reconfigures power from the powerful, elites,
The
oligarchs,
banks and whatever it might be,
to the people. And that is the vision of the social singularity. And my hope, I'll say a quick thing about subversive innovation, because I wanted to get that in, and you can use it if you want, if not. But I want to send a message to the entrepreneurs and innovators in the world. And that's, you have a threefold mandate if you want to change the world, because this isn't just about voting. This isn't just about bitching on X. This is about creating something. If you can follow three basic rules with what you create in your entrepreneurial ventures or in your technological innovations, they would be as follows. First, lower the cost of coordination and transaction. Always try to make it lower cost to coordinate with other human beings. Second, raise the cost of predation and parasitism. In other words, make it harder for those predators and those parasites to intervene and meddle in your life. Use technology to do that. Number three, reduce the cost of exiting a system that is no longer serving you or me, and make it reduce cost to enter a system that does serve us better. If you can take that threefold mandate, that is the essence of subversive innovation. That's what we've got to do now in this moment, while we're high on the spirit of this moment. Mm-hmm. If we don't apply that spirit of this moment, in other words, we can't just sit back and watch the passing show. We've got to get out there and build and do something. And that might be something as simple as helping make community ties with people, teach them how to fire a weapon, teach them how to be a prepper, teach somebody how to download a cryptocurrency wallet or a Bitcoin wallet. It might be as advanced as creating a new kind of blockchain or a new kind of technology that allows for these lateralization of human interaction, because therein lies the power of the network over the power of the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. That's the phase transition. It's as magnificent and great as the transition that came with settled agriculture, with the rise of empire, with the printing press, right? Printing press unleashed
communication and
the Renaissance, and knowledge. And this is a big one, this moment, AI, distributed ledgers, and more. This is the moment where we might be able to reconfigure instead of collapse.
We've kind of highlighted it throughout the episode, but I really wanted to deep dive the Trump administration. And
oh boy,
yeah,
my family's going to kill me.
I think a good way to kind of start off this conversation, especially that's relevant with, your philosophical take, is that what would you say are the key drivers between 2016 Trump and 2024 Trump?
I think it's knowledge of the depth and the extent of this empire of graft that currently constitutes so much of Washington. The people who wanted him dead and having a near-death experience. I'm not trying to lionize Trump. Sometimes I just wish he would be a man of action and keep his mouth shut, because he sounds so crass sometimes. And I sort of like a statesmanly type of person representing me. You know what I mean? If I'm going to have a president, then I want someone who is a little more staid and reserved in the way they speak. Every once in a while, he'll pop off a good one. I'm like, yes.
Yeah, of all the presidents we had, you got to admit, and I always say this, is like, you hate him or love him, he's funny as hell. Just some of the stuff that he says, the way he says it, or even just his facial expressions, it's like, you're one of the funniest guys. Just
absolutely,
timing, it's crazy.
Yeah, and I'm not. I'm not a voter, and I'm not a partisan, but I think I can therefore take a little bit more dispassionate view, call more balls and strikes about Trump than a lot of other people. I will say I know people and love people who are very close to me who probably think I'm a rabid Trump fan or a MAGA person. And, nothing could be further from the truth. It's much different. But anyway, getting back on track with the question, I think the difference between 2024 Trump and 2016 Trump is a fire was ignited in him. I think he's seen things. He's experienced things. Not only just coming that close to death, which would change anybody, probably realizing his own mortality anyway. I mean, the man's, 80 now?
Yeah.
But getting a sense that this is his last opportunity to leave a legacy. And enduring what he did, whether you like him or not, he was... The probability, I did a calculation using AI because I couldn't do it mathematically. I'm a math tard. But I did a calculation. I said there are I think 6 events. Let's say there were 6 major events over the course of the last few years, from the assassination attempts to the lawfare campaigns against him. Let's just say that there were 6 major events, each of which had 50% chance of being successful at taking him out of the presidential race. Calculate that in some combinatorial way, and I had to just have faith in the AI that it was, but it came out to 1.5% chance that he would become president in 2024. Now, the mathematicians might call into your show and be like, or, send you hate mail or whatever and say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Neither does his AI. And they may be right. But it's intuitively plausible that he had a 1.5% chance of being the president after all of those attacks and all of those episodes, those events in human history leading up to this. Having endured those, how would your outlook change? So being empathic with Trump seems like a strange thing to ask someone, but for me, I think I don't have much time. I've got to do this. It's now or never. I think he thinks he's saving America. And people who hate him and say, oh, he's just a narcissist. All he thinks about is himself. All he thinks about is his own personal aggrandizement. That's probably also true to a very great degree. Excuse me. But I think at some fundamental way, he wants to transcend that. And it was coming that close to death that makes him really want that he sees himself at war.
Do you think that he had an understanding too from when he entered, like, so a lot of the stuff that he campaigned on was relatively similar, the idea of making America great again, of course, but he's really flipped into more of a populist actor, like recognizing the misfortunes of American people. You know, he called for draining the swamp, but it seemed like in 24 he was really recognizing it. Yeah. Do you think he came in 16, saw how big the machine really was, and realized now in 24 with all the experience and everything, he said, you know, what it actually takes to dismantle, you know, this greater machine versus 16.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of these events built up one atop the other, right? So you think before he's even elected, he's got the Obama administration, Jim Comey, and John Brennan of the CIA at the time, both investigating him. Not just investigating him and his campaign, but trying to use honeypots, it turns out lately. At least this is the accusation. They're trying to do him in as a candidate before he even sits in the White House. Number one. Then it was Russiagate. Then it was the impeachment. And on and on and on. And you look at this stuff, and the Russiagate was a total contrivance, right? Of this, I'm sorry to say it, the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton and that machine. I wouldn't be surprised if the assassination attempts, if not the first, also the second, that both were some sort of operation. And people who love me would probably think that I'm writing conspiracy theories on that. But I don't think that these are lone crazy actors. I think that even if it was so-called stochastic terrorism, which is the idea that if you make enough comments and put them out there about how he's a threat to our democracy, or he's a fascist, or he's a Nazi, or whether you program this, you're going to excite some crazies.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself is a type of operation. It is a psyop. But I think that there might have been even more contact with the assassins, even more a closer connection between this intractable set of predators and parasites who are currently in the administrative state and those assassins. What we are seeing right now with DOGE, and DOGE is just scraping the surface. And a lot of my well-wishers, friends, more libertarian type people think that it's somehow untoward, this way that they're going about things. I think of it as there is a patient with a head wound in the security theater. You know, bring a doctor in. Doesn't matter if he's a neuroscientist or not. Like, we got to stop the bleeding. And it happens to be Elon Musk, which everybody finds very strange. It is strange. It is different. It's certainly unorthodox.
I was actually going to bring that up, or the general discussion around DOGE as well, because, I feel like there's been so much conversation around it that DOGE is coming in hyper aggressive, just kind of cutting. But I've said something similar before, is that if you genuinely want a solution, there's just so many, ribbon cutting ceremonies that need to happen, or, bureaucratic hurdles that need to be jumped if you do it like the traditional way of trying to cut budgets. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd love your thoughts, a deep dive around DOGE and like what they should be trying to accomplish, because I do think it's probably one of the first times we've really had a organized effort that wasn't playing ball with the bureaucrats in terms of cutting.
Yeah, I mean, this effort to sort of overwhelm, to flood the zone, as they put it in the press, I think is strategically probably necessary. There needs to be a way to have more permanent institutional change. Excuse me for a second. You want me to clap or something so you'll know to
Oh, no,
edit
you're
this
good.
out?
Yeah, no, you're good. No worries.
Excuse me, I had a runny nose for a second.
Oh, good.
I don't know what happened. Okay, now back to it. If they didn't flood the zone, if they didn't take this unorthodox technique, they would not have had the element of surprise. If you look at it as a network or a hierarchy of predators and parasites that have run the show since I was born, again under Nixon, a lot of people have questions surrounding even Nixon, that he was in many ways set up. Oh, conspiracy theories. But even before that, just set aside Nixon. What about the involvement of likely vice president or the deep state CIA and so on with the JFK assassination?
It's like all but confirmed at this point, too.
Well, exactly. Mm-hmm. So it's like, since before I was born, we have this president who people love, this beloved president who was killed in cold blood in this town. And my God, we have been left with those powers ever since. They didn't just go away. Qui bono, somebody benefits, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't, you can call me a conspiracy theorist all day long, and I think that the conspiracy theories are being transmogrified into conspiracy facts on a daily basis so much, except for the fact that the people who are living in the bubbles, the filter bubbles, like, mm-hmm. monkey see, monkey,
the government's all
hear
good.
no evil, speak no evil, right?
Yeah, they wouldn't do anything wrong.
They don't want to. They don't want to believe that this stuff is happening and has been happening for decades, right? But there was a kind of d'entente between the branches of the original three branches of government, but also in some sense between the administrative state, the national security state, what we collectively now call the deep state, right, and these other branches of government. I think there was a sort of like. I can't remember who it was. I think it was the senator from New York. What's his name? Anyway, the old guy who's he's
blanking on the name.
He's old. He's
his face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He said something to the effect on the news media. You better not cross the FBI or the CIA. Mm-hmm. One. They'll do you in, basically. They'll get you 6 waves from Sunday, is what I think he said. Mm-hmm. And he's not wrong. He's like, we got to play ball. So they have this whole, again, empire of graft that's dependent on debt spending, and they're not about to let it go, because what slinks from the coital bed of mama money, and papa power, as we said earlier, is fascism. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to think of our country as being a fascist country in this sense, this grotesque administrative state. And so I have friends who are very much like, Congress needs to resolve this. We need to be more procedurally minded. I'm like, no, we need to do what it takes. Walk right up to the legal line. We need to do it fast. We need to do it powerfully, and we need to do it permanently. And I worry it's in that last one that we're not going to get it. Mm-hmm. Because their concern is that we already have too powerful administrative state. And if you give it more power to undo itself, then when the next administration gets into power, they're just going to abuse it in a different way. I don't know, but we've got to do something. Mm-hmm. Like, we are at the precipice now. This is triage. It's like, take it however you can get it. If it's DOGE, it's DOGE. I'm heartened by one thing, though. We have developed a communications and transparency system that is unprecedented, right? So we have developed a set of expectations around being able to see how the money's spent and being able to observe it, sort of like in a peer-to-peer army of checkers. I don't think that's going to go away. Like, if that persists, even if we don't have an institutional reform, like Congress comes in and says, mm-hmm. We should have the ability to audit all expenditures on the blockchain immediately. No. even if what we get is the demand for DOGE-like entities to exist and to give us information and have that be immediate, because we know you're bullshitting us when you say you can't give it to us right now. I think that in and of itself will be a reform that matters that came out of this. Mm-hmm. I do worry, though, I really do, Reed, that we're just going to go back to the status quo and they will have won. Mm-hmm. And we'll continue to get shafted.
So let me ask you a question then, going back to the idea of deep state actors being involved with some of the stuff that's been happening over the past, decade at this point with Trump. Why do you think that they would want to kill someone like Trump?
That's a good question. I think the simplest answer is I don't know. But if I had to speculate, I don't think he's ever been part of the club. And what I mean by the club is that there was an evolving thing called the blob, right? That I call the glob because it extends globally. So it's the global blob. But the blob is known as basically the sort of perverse interactions among the administrative state actors, proxies, powers, from USAID to the CIA to the FBI to all these, well-paid, underworked bureaucrats, congressmen, the whole kit and caboodle in Washington, and its extended tendrils and tentacles, right? They protect their own and they generate their own. George W. Bush came out of the CIA.
How do you mean?
I'm sorry. George Herbert Walker Bush came out of the CIA. George W. Bush was his son. So there's sort of like a legacy there. Mm-hmm. And he came up in Texas politics connected, and his whole family's connected to the national security state. So, we get these kind of entities. This is the thing. It's interesting thing about Kennedy. He was an outlier in this regard too, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, I think his father, wealthy as he was connected with or part of the Irish mafia.
Yeah, and he was a soldier too, like very much, and saw combat directly.
Yeah. So it's like you get these outsiders and they win based on some sort of popular groundswell, and the deep state people want to install their folks. I think Barack Obama, if we knew more about his past and his upbringing, I think we would find that he is very likely a product of the glob, much more than we thought. We always, got this story that he's this community organizer from Chicago, from Hyde Park. And, he is just a rising star because he's this wonderful orator and everything like that. But something tells me there's more to it.
I think if they go all in on you, they indicate you as someone with potential is when you start getting the handshakes and the conversations. Like you were saying this earlier, when you look at politicians that you look at and say, I at least trust this person. I always say this, Bernie Sanders, even if I don't agree with his politics, I feel like he cares. And you could tell because he consistently goes against the Democratic Party pretty heads on. And it was clear as day in 2016 where it was his election and they just said, no, we don't want you.
They cut his legs out from under him.
Yeah.
And I agree. It's like I was talking when we were talking earlier about, virtuous politicians, which is almost a contradiction in terms, especially if we don't agree about what those virtues are for a politician, right? One person's Bernie Sanders compared to another person's Thomas Massey. I like Thomas Massey. I think he's a good man. Mm-hmm. And I think he really does have the country's best interest at heart. I don't agree with him on absolutely everything, but good, into the 90th percentile, right? Whereas Bernie, it would be the exact opposite. But I think up into the last few years when he finally stopped, he he knew he needed to stop fighting because he wasn't going to win. I think he was what we see now as a Bernie Sanders of resignation. I think, and his followers thought that he was a good man and that he was mostly immune to these forces of incentive and threats of power, but it was just too strong. And look, I think at some level, Trump, as narcissistic as he can be, and as he offends the sensibilities of so many people, particularly those on the left. But I think people who want to live in a fantasy that their leaders are a certain kind of person, because that telegraphs their virtue, even though it's not true. I mean, Biden was such a scumbag. And the people who absolutely hate Trump
loved him.
Loved Biden, or at least thought he was a good man. Mm-hmm. It's like, are you kidding? With the corruption that happened, the affronts to the emoluments clause in the Constitution, with all this, taking money from foreigners, and I mean, it's like from foreign countries, foreign actors. As you were vice president, all of these scandals around his inappropriate relationships with young women. I mean, there's this. The whole thing, it's like they nope, I don't want to look. We think of him as a good man, and so he is. And he's on our team. But the corruption that he enabled, that we're only now just turning over the mossy rocks and seeing all the snakes and snails, right now, still happening. That no, they just refuse to believe. Okay, we grudgingly acknowledge that he had dementia, but we don't want to grudgingly acknowledge that he was kind of a bad person. I mean, like we said, politics selects for sociopaths. The Bernie Sanders of the world and the Thomas Masseys of the world are rare. Most of the time you attract the worst. Mm-hmm. So the administrative state, the blob, the glob, all of it is composed largely of people who love money and power and where it intersects. Sociopaths.
And willing to give up their virtues for it.
Yep.
So how did Trump be able to avoid that glob? Or I guess, again, like, why are they looking to target? Why are they going after him so harshly? Is it because he doesn't want to have any connection with that glob? Or is it because he's willing to also...
I think he's trying to tear it down. Mm-hmm. I think he believes it tried to kill him.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that shifted from 16 to 24?
Like I said, everything he endured over those years. Mm-hmm. I think he truly believes that the 2020 election was stolen from him, as a lot of people do. I remain Switzerland on that question. I just don't know. There are a lot of indications that there were shenanigans. When you have a certain amount of sort of like vote dumps in the middle of the night after people go to bed and they're in key swing states, it starts to look really unlikely.
Yeah, and even with that too, I always say, like, I don't even care about the voting because whatever, like, one way or another. My whole idea is if you're going to have a genuine conversation around that, I think it's less to even focus on the voting and it's more to focus on the idea that the CIA coming out and saying the Hunter Biden laptop was fake, which would have been a November surprise.
Well, exactly.
Like that, those type of things, the Atlantic or whatever it was coming out with an article saying how all the media essentially like blocked him or pushed information that was for the other side. Like in itself, that's election interference. Now,
I mean, the people taking our tax dollars to fund the censorship industrial complex.
Yeah.
People taking our tax dollars to fund all of these organs who propagated this deep state tall tale. 50 former, intelligence officials say this has all the earmarks of Russian disinformation or a Russian information campaign. And it was just a way of saying, hand wavy, this is all BS. Turns out it was that laptop was a Pandora's box of all the evidence we needed to know that Joe Biden was corrupt and would be willing to lie about it. and yet people still look wistfully back on this doddering, demented man who turns out for most of his career was corrupt, still have some sort of respect for people like John Brennan, CIA director under Obama, who's about the most evil person in the world, Jim Comey, all of these deep state actors who sought at every turn of and to undermine Trump. From the perspective of Trump, it's like when I'm back in power, I've got to figure out how to at least root and branch, tear out these corrupt actors. They're part of the same they're part of the same inside baseball social club, and they all benefit from the absorptive power of the glob, both in money and power, and they'll stop at nothing to keep me away from it. Because I've promised to, in 2016, it was drain the swamp. Now, I don't know, and people are like, oh, he's such an authoritarian. He's such an authoritarian. It's like, so you're okay with the fourth branch of government, which is this grotesque administrative state. But you're worried about the pedantic proceduralism of Trump sending in Elon Musk and a bunch of teenagers to figure all this stuff out in some kind of unorthodox audit. It's like, give me a break. I'm sorry. I just can't. I have no time for that. I don't care if he goes into the Department of the Treasury in his underwear. Just like, let's clean this stuff out. It is destroying our country. It is a cancer on the back of this republic. And like I told you, I don't think they're going to be able to, but I don't think that means that they shouldn't try.
Why do you not think they'll be able to, though? What do you think is going to be the hurdles they're jumping over?
The administrative state has evolved to such a degree. It's sort of like a, what do you call like a snakehead fish or kudzu? It's not supposed to be here. An alien.
I saw a turtle in a tree. It's my favorite. It's not supposed to be up there.
Well, yeah. What do you call those? Invasive species.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's something that, from a constitutional perspective, this fourth branch of government, let's call it the administrative state, this extended, NGOs and people who are dependent on the funding, the largesse and power of the federal government, right? It has grown out of the executive and Congress. And it's not been able to be stopped by the judiciary. So when you get this inadvertent collusion between the executive and the Congress to feed this beast, it grows and becomes its own entity, and it evolves and it develops mechanisms to defend itself, whether those be legal or procedural or just how to tug at the heartstrings of the American people, because all those poor federal employees who are being let go, whatever, the river of crocodiles' tears is flowing right now. And we're all sitting around going, we're about to go bankrupt, and you're
Yeah, you're working on the last dollars.
You tax us to death. So like, the people aren't buying it yet necessarily, but the American public is kind of fickle. And if we don't develop some sort of core set of values and principles and idea that and indeed mechanisms for both transparency and a check on that authority, the only popular check on that authority are elections, and they only come around every 2 years, every 4 years. That's not enough. We've got to develop some more. Transparency mechanisms are one, but that might not be enough either. The incentives are strong within that nexus of graft. I just think they are so strong, and they are already spinning these narratives and apologetics for why they're, paladins bestride white horses who are going to stop us from this evil dictator who's trying to ruin our democracy. No, it's how it's always very vague the way they talk.
And extreme as well. It's never just, this is bad because it's like, this is going to destroy everything. Like, it's always super dramatic.
Well, exactly. Mm-hmm. And, people who I'm close to, they see everything on a left-right continuum, right? So they think because I am angry, what Congress is up to right now, the Republican-controlled Congress is up to right now, with respect to spending, it just makes my head want to explode with anger. Like, I have nothing but contempt for these Republicans in Congress right now. It's like, you're going to go out here with all this DOGE stuff and then you're going to pass something that's going to add trillions to the national debt now? What are you doing and what are you thinking? Mm-hmm. And maybe you can give me some idea about the only way to get rid of the debt is to inflate, and the only way to inflate is to pass a bunch of stuff in this bill. I don't get that. But what it says to me is that the incentives are so powerful with Congress to rein large us on their supplicants and friends in the military-industrial complex and so on, that it's an unstoppable force. It is pushing us towards insolvency. So when I'm going nuts and going crazy and doing my old man rant, shaking my fist from the front porch about politicians, it's generally about those who are in power. The Trump administration, in some odd way, is giving me hope that maybe now it's going to be different. Mm-hmm. But how many times have we heard that with every election cycle? Maybe now it'll be different. Maybe with this, anyway, the idea that politicians are going to save us never turns out to be the case.
I will say, though, the one kind of key point, I think, this is where this is all stemming from, but what you brought up is that Trump really seems like an outsider for the first time in a long while, even more so than he did in 2016. And this is actually a question I was going to ask, but it seemed like in 2016 he was really running on nationalism, which, sure has a bad connotation with, fascism and all that, but nationalism in itself is
he thinks of it as America first.
Yeah. It shouldn't be taboo again to talk about that. But nationalism was kind of the 2016 driver. While in 2024, it flipped to something akin to populism. And in a lot of way, there's this someone who's coming on the show sooner or later, but his name's Moser Z. It's a great YouTube channel, and he kind of deep dives all more political thought in more than just exactly like you're saying. It's not just a line. It goes up, down, and sideways. The idea of Trumpism being the new, right ideology, no longer conservatism or neoconservatism or anything like that, but instead this idea of a mixture of populism. And it feels like for the first time in a while, it's a genuine attempt at a more populist approach to governance. Mm-hmm. And again, like, it's so interesting to see how much that has flipped and how much his base has really turned the corner and started supporting populist ideas as well.
Yeah, and populists can be demagogues, and demagogues can become dictators. So you always have to be careful of that. Mm-hmm. I mean, people are not wrong to have that concern because it has a lot of historical precedent. And so I'm saying when I hear you say that maybe this time it's different because there's a populist strain, the left-right continuum is the way people tend to think of things. It's very, it's one-dimensional. You can use the Nolan chart. I don't know if you know about David Nolan, but he was a political scientist who developed this chart, and you can add another dimension.
The quadrants.
Where you create quadrants. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so from top to bottom, you get, libertarian, like ultra freedom. And then down at the bottom, you get authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And so left and right, and then orthogonally to that, or the y-axis being this, liberty to authority, starts to create a different picture. It's not a perfect picture because we've got some weird stuff going on now in the political environment that kind of breaks the Nolan chart. but it's enough of a way of getting you to think outside of the unidimensionality of the left-right continuum to see that it's like, okay, if we start to plot these on this matrix, things could start to look different. And what the promising aspect of populism, such as it is, because there's some features of populism that are, it's like, we're about us, don't protect our jobs, like you're entitled to a job by virtue of being a certain nationality, right? And that can give rise to some of the worst excesses of unions. And I'm not saying unions are all bad, but unions can have their excesses. You have to be on guard about the excesses of populism and the tendency, the drift towards like installing strong men. And that's what people are worried about with Trump. If Trump doesn't go in that direction and really is about making the focus of this presidency a reorganization around decentralizing these systems a little bit, introducing more checks, even if the checks seem odd or unorthodox, there may be a chance and it may be able to be built upon. But I don't see it in a partisan way, except for the fact that the Democrats seem so hopelessly evil and lost.
Yeah. Well, they seem angry about it. And I think that what's crazy is you seem to have this, and here, I guess this is going to go to my next question, but there was a huge conversation post the election where you had people like Bernie Sanders who was saying, hey guys, on the Democrat, like, we need to wake up because you're all wrong. I've been saying it forever. And now I'm actually, he was basically in limbo or in retirement. He came out for a little bit to say, hey, we need to figure this out. A number of, thought candidates, the people, the Young Turks, really came out harsh on the Democratic Party, basically saying like, hey, we need to rethink what we're doing. There doesn't seem to be that much push from the atypical politicians, the ones that are aligned to the Clintons, the ones that are aligned to Kamala Harris, to Biden, to those individuals. And that's where
there's so many interesting characters out there. Yeah. Batya Ungar-Sargon is one of them. She's really populist, like old school populist. Mm-hmm. Like, what about the working people? This is what the left was always supposed to be allowed. Mm-hmm. Now you've pushed me to the right, she screams, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's no longer, it's left. The left is now the province of the elites. It is the province of the people who want to occupy the administrative state or the salaried class and basically, tell everybody else what to do and make sure that this immigrant can continue to cut my grass, and I can intellectualize all this in some kind of weird social justice fundamentalism. I mean, that's what we have now, mm-hmm. is an elite that thinks this way, and they live in a bubble and they reinforce each other's messages. And then, but you had these defectors. You've got the Matt Taibbi's of the world, or Taibbi, who's kind of a spit and sawdust reporter who, kind of came out of that world, which is like moderate Democrat. And he's like, no, you guys left me.
Yep.
Party-wise. Michael Schellenberger, man of the left. He's really interesting. And he's doing all this stuff, uncovering everything from the censorship industrial complex to the deep state operatives who were going after Trump and the funding that went to it from USAID. I mean, that is in itself revolutionary. These really interesting characters that are neither nor. Glenn Greenwald has always been a unique character. His North Star is civil liberties, right? He's not, he'd probably be happy with socialized medicine or whatever, but he is not willing to become a DNC hack. And all of these defectors are being perceived as joining the Trump train. And in some sense they are, but it's only because that's the game in town right now. And so they're helping with this disentangling of national security, of the glob, from what is meant to be a simpler, better republic with constitutional limits. And our Constitution is all but Swiss cheese now. So whether you can roll that back, I cannot say, but it's interesting to see these people fight for something that we once had in common as a people.
That's why I think the Trump admin is so important, whether you're on the left or right. You should actually be hoping for a success in this approach, because what I do think happens is that you're always going to have Bernie Sanders on the left who disagrees with Trump fundamentally on a lot of different items, but he really wants to get rid of a lot of the bureaucratic stuff as well. He looks at that. And so what happens is that if Trump is successful in this, if people are exposed to just how corrupt that, executive class, for lack of a better word, has really become, the bureaucracy that really goes into a lot of these federal, programs, and how much money's being wasted and why inflation's going up is because spending's out of control and all these different things, is that you get Democrats either have to evolve, which means that you'll have a lot of politicians that are switching, that are no longer going to want to organize, and they're willing in 2028. That's the platform they're going to run on, and that's where the country starts to shift. Or they'll simply disappear as a relevant party, because in 28, if stuff's working, people are going to go vote. Same thing that they voted this election around, So that's why I think it's really interesting, is that if he and the admin is successful in this, at least opening the door, it forces the Democrats also to kind of get kicked in the butt and start approaching that more decentralized approach as well, because that's where the contingency of voters are.
That and that'd be great. I mean, I would love to be able to see enough of those boxes ticked to be able to support a Democrat, right? Or be perceived as supporting a Democrat. Because it looks right now like I'm, MAGA. It's like, no, I want to go up on the Nolan chart. I don't want to go left or right.
Yeah.
And all I see is, it's right now I'm following strange bedfellows north on the chart, right? The people we were just talking about, who want to return to sanity, to limited government, to a constitutional republic. I mean, I'd like to take it even further, because I think that there are problems of incentives and accretion of power that is baked in to the sort of the Constitution as it's currently construed and is currently interpreted and enforced. That might be able to be fixed with amendments. It might not. But it's really hard to get an amendment through. It's just a high bar. So what does this is a really good question. What does this revolution look like for the parties internally? Do the, I mean, I don't think these sort of Clintonista type, was old Raging Cajun, guys like that. I mean, he gets it. He gets that they've created a circular firing squad of sorts. I'm not sure his nostra are all that helpful, except keep your mouth shut and stop talking in social justice gibberish. That is all well and good, but that's not gonna be a phoenix from the flames, right? Or a phoenix from the ashes. What would be for the Democrats? Like, what does that new Democrat look like? Because he can't look too much like Trump. Trump is just kind of like, he's kind of like he's in many ways kind of like a New York Democrat from the 80s.
Yeah.
And with that populist streak, it's just almost like his experiences are prompting him to introduce measures the likes of which I've never seen in my lifetime that may actually work, that may actually pull us back from the precipice. I don't know. I'd love to see that. But the Republican Party is really evolving too. You're starting to see the difference between the old Chamber of Commerce Republicans and the
Mitch
and
McConnell's.
the Mitch McConnell types, and then there the defense contractor type Republicans, which kind of they got co-opted by the Democrats there for a while, especially with Ukraine.
Yep.
It's just amazing to see that suddenly the Democrats became the war party, and people I know and love who are Democrats become more bellicose. After chiding me rightly for going into Iraq back in 2002 or whatever, 2003. They were right. I was wrong. And now it's almost like the script has flipped and they're just like, oh, well, I can kind of see it now because my party does it. Rah, rah, rah. You know, it's really strange to see all these changes. And it doesn't make for, because on the Nolan chart, you have economic freedom and personal freedom as the kind of the levers. And it's really weird. Like it's like a grab bag of whatever you choose. Freedom is not really a North Star for anyone. Just depending on where you want it personally.
Yeah, I almost feel like Trump has almost established his new version of politics where, and we could see this evolution as well if we start getting into, instead of just, Democrats, Republicans, we start seeing introduction of a third and fourth and fifth, different parties, but more generalized, like I don't think he can really be categorized as either. And I think a lot of politicians that will follow will start kind of having their own lane, their own, as you're saying, a grab bag of, we're kind of going towards this direction, like on the chart, leaning towards the libertarian, we're pushing in this direction. You have ones that are pushing that, every which direction. And I think that's what's so interesting is for the first time, we're getting a really dynamic shift in political thought and political allegiances in terms of what defines a politician and who they align with, Yeah.
Yeah, it's there's so many unknowns because there are things about Trump that are really inconsistent, and some would argue that no, the consistency's there, you just have to look for it. But like sometimes one's consistency is the power of consistency lies in how it's perceived by others, not just whether you have an internal consistency. So, the sort of random threats of economic terrorism, tariffs, which are really just, I'm not a fan of tariffs. It's like you're shooting your own people in the foot and you're telling them they can't trade with people just because they live on the other side of a different border. But I also understand that there's a lot of issues with national security that we have to pay attention to. So targeted tariffs, perhaps, and some countries have done it, perhaps not because, but despite, like South Korea, for example, has had pretty high tariffs and protectionism and is a pretty strong economy, and they're having demographic problems now, bad. But so I don't want to be too dogmatic and say, but if it doesn't seem like it makes any sense and it seems like it's a negotiating tactic, people are going to get wise to you fast. And then if you were only using it as a negotiating tactic, but didn't realize that it was going to be harmful to your people or harmful economically, and that you are actually shooting yourself in the foot, then you've got to deal with the fallout of that. It's like, oh, well, trade with Canada has now cost us 20%, and that hurts them, it hurts us. And it doesn't seem like it makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be, I will say there's tons of things I disagree with Trump on. People that know what the show, I mean, sometimes you get some of the Looney Tunes too that'll be in the comments, be like, you're always shitting on Trump. I'm like, we speak positively of him a lot as well.
Right.
But
you got to call them as you see them.
I'm never going to agree with every politician on everything too. That's just the case. You know what I mean? I love JD Vance. I think he seems like an awesome, for 2028 could be an awesome, next man up. I'm sure there's plenty I disagree with him on as well. And, like I said, I have a lot that I look at Bernie as a really good politician, a lot that I disagree with him. You should be able to disagree, but then, I think, again, the one benefit to Trump, and kind of highlighting the conversation, is he could bring the air to change of decentralization to a lot of these industries that could shift that in 10 years' time. We get somebody that's more akin to your political alignment. But we need, none of these changes are ever smooth or sweet. They're always tough. They're always going to be tough.
Yeah.
So, I think that's part of the risk reward here is he's going to do some crazy things. He's Trump, but he might be our best bet in terms of at least our current selection of politics for a good while to actually, get closer or a step closer to some of this decentralization that we desperately need as a country.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like the closest things to my ideal societies look more like Switzerland or Liechtenstein or, and it's not to say that they're completely ideal. I mean, Liechtenstein is like the residue of monarchy, but it's so small and it's so decentralized. It's like they've done a really good job. Singapore, it has its faults. It's like you sell somebody a bag of dope, they'll kill you, right? That's kind of like that's a little much.
On the subway.
Yeah. They'll cane you if you chew gum in public and something like that. I don't know. But, Lee Kuan Yew was an economic genius and created a beautiful, rich society. There are things to admire about it. There are things to admire about Dubai. There are things to admire about Hong Kong. And this kind of these small city-state model where it's like these all have something in common. You have to ask yourself what those things are. And if you can make microstates, we've got 50 of them right now, start to look more like Hong Kong and Dubai and so on. Yeah, it might not be this massive Leviathan country with a huge military and military spending, but that transition, that decentralized transition, may make for a series of healthy societies and choices that create internal dynamics, competitive dynamics that make us all safer, all more prosperous, and indeed free.
Let's talk about one of the key figures. Some may look at him as Trump's right-hand man currently, not J.D. Vance, but Elon Musk a little more deep. As the world's richest man, is he a force for decentralization, or, some people may look at it as kind of another centralizing elite?
That's a really good question. I think there's a couple of things about him I'll say. I think he sees the limits of technocracy, right? So he knows what it means to build an amazing company that produces reusable rockets, or a car company that does amazing things with self-driving vehicles that are, part of the energy transition, so-called. And so on. I mean, he's got lots of projects and companies that he supports. I think he's enough of a sci-fi geek to have read his Robert Heinlein, for example. Robert Heinlein has this very anarchist sensibility that I think that Musk probably admires. I think Musk has been so attacked by the glob in recent years that, while far more pragmatic, sees the benefits and blessings of decentralization, at least in the abstract. He doesn't hate crypto, for example. And crypto is still a churning ecosystem that's still finding its properties and still trying to stabilize. And it's not just a gambling casino for geeks. But as it evolves, I think he's going to witness that. And he's always been concerned that OpenAI, which he helped found, would be open source and not proprietary for this very reason, because it would be decentralized. So he has expressed sentiments that move in the decentralist direction. Mm-hmm. And I think he appreciates the power of what I call underthrow. Shameless plug, I hope people join my Substack, underthrow.org. If you think about overthrowing power, that's violent. Think about underthrowing it. It's about creating those subversive innovations that pull power, the feet of power out from under it, right? So it's underthrow. It sort of sounds like undertow, but you underthrow. It's Michael Gibson's term, Michael P. Gibson, great writer. I took it and ran with it. And underthrowing power, I think, is something that Elon Musk sees. His acquisition of X, which didn't have any immediate term promise of being profitable to make him richer, closer, right? He's like, all of the media and communication industries have been captured, and so we've got to have something that allows. Now, as you said earlier, the sort of proto-fascist types are there are a lot of them on there, and it gets gross.
And they're getting attracted to him, to be frank, too, which is...
Well, yeah. I mean, and maybe that's good, or let's just hope that he doesn't get attracted to them.
Yes.
If you don't think that he's a Nazi because he threw up the thing in a goofy way at that event. I happen not to. But I think he is a change agent. I think he's a disruptor. And I get the feeling that his prime motivation is to get to Mars. I mean, I really do. He says so much.
I think so as well. Because he looks at humanity can be gone in a blink of an eye with a plethora of things, and we've basically been here for a blink of an eye. And I genuinely think that he thinks we need to get the hell off this rock and, get over there. So I fully agree with that.
Yeah. So I think Musk is basically a sci-fi geek who grew up freakishly smart. He is an entrepreneur. He's a great entrepreneur. I don't care. I know that he depends on government subsidy and government, all kinds of things, but he's in industries that make this. He's dealing with a monopsony with SpaceX, for example, and I gather he's probably benefited, but he's said very plainly he's happy to get rid of subsidies on Tesla, these green subsidies, these green, supports where people can get favorable tax treatment if they buy a green vehicle. He's ready to get rid of them because he believes in Tesla. But that disruptor come sci-fi geek in a weird pragmatic way is working right now. And we'll see where it goes. I hope that he doesn't change. I hope that he doesn't turn into an autocrat who gets out over his skis or tries to attempt something that he can't possibly achieve. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it seems like the worry here, and like I said, another centralizing elite is, if you follow him on Twitter, you see he's consistently posting or communicating ideas that are very similar to decentralization, talking for privatizing tons of different government industries, talking about, creating more of a populist government as well. Like all these things that would be akin to some of the conversation points we were saying. The fear comes is that as the world's richest man, if he's getting in control of all these different private agencies, it's like, are we just doing centralization somewhere else? Mm-hmm. However, I think he's been such a key change agent, as you were highlighting, with buying X and opening the platform for that type of communication. And when you have that big of a platform himself, even putting those ideas out there, talking about cryptocurrency and, naming the damn agency DOGE, which is you're going to get people to support it because they're going to look into it and read it and, they're going to make their own decisions. So it's a funny balance because it's like, I get why people would be worried that he may accumulate too much power, but he's also doing a lot of things currently that's flipping stuff the opposite direction that realistically, I mean, you look at 2020, we were going the complete other way in terms of centralization, in terms of people being able to have those conversations and topics. And it's funny that it kind of aligned with the crypto explosion as well, as when people started that's when everything really started taking off. So, it is an interesting thought because, again, he's the world's richest man. So one way or another.
Well, and, of course, it's like anyone else. It's like you're going to find things about him you disagree with or you find objectionable. Mm-hmm. The whole pumping Doge thing that he was doing for a while. It's like, why? Meme coins? What are the properties about Doge that make it appreciably different from any other token? Why that? It's like, okay, whatever. He's got his thing. He wants to goof around with it, but he's a market mover, and there are people who are willing to climb on these risky kinds of things with someone like him because they believe in him. So, you got to be careful with that power. But I did hear someone famous say that probably the last thing you want to do is bet against Elon. Mm-hmm. And then for someone like that, someone with that level of efficacy, you got to hope they're working mostly on your side.
Yeah. So what do you think his goal is with Doge then? Even, again, he's the world's richest man, got tons of companies that he's running, and yet he's taking his time to be a part of Doge and this system that's trying to dismantle and, at least bring to light what is really happening in the bureaucratic state. So what do you think his goal is with Doge?
I think it's multi-layers. Right, multiple layers. Mm-hmm. I think the first thing that he wants to do is expose just the extent of all of this. And he's done that. We have had our eyes on something that you could scarcely ever get people to think about. We've had our eyes on it for a month now. And that is the extent of what, they term waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. That is extremely powerful right there. So now we become vigilant. He's changing the mindset of the ordinary person, of the ordinary voter, so that there's a mass constituency around being attuned to that. That is kind of new. It used to be that only people who were into politics and economics would talk about the national debt, and everybody else was just like, leave me alone to watch my Netflix or watch my ball game, right? But this is been able to penetrate the baseball and Netflix crowd. Mm-hmm. The second thing is establishing an expectation for transparency going forward, a formalized mechanism whereby we can look at how things are spent, and those can be transparent, and those messages can be go through media channels. If you don't do that, at least if he achieves that, he's achieved something. And then the third layer, I think, and probably the most important that he hopes, is that he will be able to align with Congress in a way that allows for lasting reform, because Congress makes the laws and controls the power of the purse. Both of those things are going to be required to have any kind of permanent efficacy with respect to the executive is pruning right now. It's pruning. It's like showing us the horrors, and it's making some marginal internal reforms, but it's limited in what it can do. Mm-hmm. Right? I think it's really hard for the system as it's currently configured to remedy itself.
It's kind of what we were highlighting. Their job isn't to actually get the job done. It's to let you guys know there's a job there.
Yeah, that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And it looks like Congress doesn't really have any appetite right now to join forces with them. Even though they talk a big game, then they give us this massive turd of a bill, pork-laden bill that's going to add more and more to the national debt. It's like, what is going on? They're up to something. They're either, yeah, I can't imagine, I can't square the circle. So I don't know what to say about that, except it's like maybe Musk, in my desire to see him succeed with this, he's actually tilting at windmills. I hope not.
Do you think there's also a chance too that he recognizes, similar to what we were kind of highlighting in the midpoint of this conversation, the collapse of this empire? Like, this might be one of our last best bets to really achieve his main goal, the goal of getting to Mars and making us a multi-planet species. Like, do you think that he looks at that and sees we're right at the end of the empire and every decision right now can dictate which way that goes?
Yeah, I'm not terribly persuaded by the idea that Mars is the place to go to make us multiplanetary. It's so harsh and uninhabitable, and the gravitational influence is different. We're not evolved for it. I mean, there's just so many things. It's one thing to say we want to do it because we can, and it inspires us and fills us with wonder. Like, what if we could actually get to another planet? That would be awesome. That indulges the sci-fi geek in all of us, right? Just like when Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon. It was a technocrat's wet dream, and everybody was sold by that dream. But the mission to Mars thing, the idea that we're going to colonize Mars or something, I think we should first of all, I think we should just do the moon first and like get good at doing the moon, being on the moon, living on the moon, terraforming the moon, if we were going to do it. And by we, I mean they were going to take our money to do it, not Mars. So I'm not terribly persuaded or excited by the idea of Mars. Maybe I could be. But as someone who is, as I said, an asymptotic anarchist, I don't really want my tax dollars going to that. I don't think I would have wanted my tax dollars going to an international pissing contest with the Russians back in the 60s either. You know what I mean? So we got to the moon and we were, had bragging rights. But that's about it. It's not like we got a whole hell of a lot out of it as a people, except, wow, we did that. But it's sort of like if this is, but the pragmatic and cynical side of me says, if Elon can continue to do what he's doing and institute some sort of one of the layers of these kinds of reforms that will allow us to rein this in and bring us back from the precipice, if giving him a trip to fucking Mars is the cost of that, then let's do it.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, Mars, it's, there's Venus. There's a lot of questions. I tend to agree with Musk on it purely just because I do, coming from a physics background and just really loving space, I get worried that humanity in a blink of an eye from just anything. Like, I don't know if you saw recently that one meteor that they were increasing the percentage. Luckily it's down, but increasing percentage. And, it was going to hit either the ocean or it was like a few South American countries in the Middle East. People were like, well, it's not an economic hub. I'm like, I don't think you guys realize that.
No, that's a planetary scale extinction event.
Yeah, or not even like it wasn't even necessarily it was at large. It's just it would be large enough. It doesn't even have to be like the one that hit the dinosaurs and kills everybody. If it's large enough that it's,
it's a nuclear war, a global nuclear war in all the major cities.
Exactly. Like the weather changes, plenty of people are going to die, economies are going to shift. Like,
yeah,
and that can happen tomorrow because we miss them all the time. That. There's just so much out there.
It blocks out the sun for a month.
Yeah.
And everything dies. People have to survive.
Exactly.
They probably will, but like by the skin of their teeth.
And we're not leaving the planet again for another, couple thousand years. So,
So he sees it as a redundancy system,
exactly.
not an ideal situation.
Exactly. Yeah. Like we get there, we format, and then from there, and
well, that's what I like about the moon though.
Yeah. And I think that's a great, like, I think we should take pretty much all of them on because the more the better, we're more spread out. But like I do get the contingency as well as, I say this, is it's never going to be perfect and it's something we have to work towards. But my hope, and he might not see this way, people might not, my hope is that the perfect part of that approach is we can reach something akin to like a Star Trek civilization where humanity's living, a decentralized system, but in the sense that we're all one general community. You know what I mean? Like being able to become multiplanetary or something similar means that we no longer have to look at conflicting with China, Russia. You know what I mean? It's like maybe we can make that next step, which allows us to continue that evolution politically, mentally in terms of our thought and the way that we communicate. There's just a lot that goes into it. But I absolutely agree too. It's like we don't want to just we can't just do that and not focus on all the stuff that we have going on back home. that's kicking our ass.
That's true. Yeah, certainly.
But I wanted to touch on blockchain and crypto a little bit as well there because, you've been mentioning it throughout the show, and I think it's going to be instrumental here in the next couple decades. What's your viewpoint on crypto? And I guess if you had to point towards a shining light example in that community, what would it be? Because many might just think Bitcoin right off the bat, but there's so much to it.
I used the metaphor earlier for crypto as an ecosystem. And I want you to think about it that way. I mean, let me try to get your folks, who are sitting here with us right now, having been with us this long, to think of it as like visiting the Great Barrier Reef. There are going to be spiny, poisonous things in there. There are going to be a moray eel tries to bite you, and there might be some sharks that are dangerous. But in its totality, in its scope, in its scale, in its beauty, in its interdependence, it is a beautiful interdependence ecosystem. So you can't really look at a single token as being like, okay, this. I make fun of the. Let me give you an example. I make fun of the Bitcoin maximalists. Mm-hmm. You know about the maxis? Mm-hmm. Okay. I make fun of them a little bit, and yet I'm a Bitcoin mostly. All right. So I'm not a maxi, I'm a mostly. And I design my portfolio in kind of a hierarchy with, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the foundation on which you build because it's, it's kind of digital gold and it's pretty safe. And maybe that'll change. I have some sympathies towards some of the, the block size wars that happened back in 2016 and 17, but whatever. Bitcoin's the base layer. And I own most of my crypto is in that. And then you want to, you're going to build on, with increased risk, you want to go higher up the pyramid, right? You want to have less and less built on that foundation if you think that Bitcoin is secure and so on. And I'm using a hierarchy or a pyramid metaphor when I had been talking about an ecosystem, but I promise I'm going to go back to it. This is just the way I'm trying to show my investment portfolio. The reason I see it that way is because of the ecosystem thing. So the representation of my portfolio is a pyramid where it's smaller and smaller tokens. As you get to the top, there's smaller and smaller part of my portfolio is these crazy, what the maxis call shit coins, mm-hmm. But are interesting tokens with interesting properties that might be able to allow for new things in the future, like DeFi. There's not really much DeFi action going on the Bitcoin blockchain. It does what it does, and it's really good at security. It's really good at decentralization. It's really good it's not so good as a store of value because it's super volatile, but that could change in time as people become to embrace it more and stop you treating it as a speculative asset. Yeah. They think of it. That's going to be some of the change in psychology if it's going to happen at all. It's still a high performing asset over the last 15 years relative to every other thing. Mm-hmm. So mad props to Bitcoin. It was the first. Now, then you have stuff like Ethereum or Cardano or Solana, and these are all interesting tokens, and they all have different properties. And if you want to build this, you want to do this with it, you want this set of properties that maybe Cardano has, and so on, to the point that they're also evolving constantly in this churn in this ecosystem. And if you think of them as organisms in the ecosystem, they're all evolving constantly. Mm-hmm. And they're becoming stronger. They're becoming better. And as they become stronger and better, especially at decentralization, that's in service to you and to me. That makes for a hardy technological substrate on which we can build the next civilization. We can build the new America, right? The one that if there is a collapse, after collapse, we want to build a new America. That's part of the infrastructure, is this ecosystem of properties. And now we're starting to see technologies that allow the different chains to connect and to interchange. So they're starting to have mutualism between the organisms, just like in the Great Barrier Reef or just like in the Amazon rainforest. When you think of crypto this way, realizing that you're going to have, people who are into Lambos and mooning tokens and meme coins and shit coins and NFTs of, Bored Apes, all of this bullshit and waste, it's part of the churn of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. It's at the very least, people who bought an NFT learned how to download and use a wallet and save a seed phrase. You know what I mean? So
yeah, like technological Darwinism almost.
Right. And they might have lost a bunch of money, but they're now programmed to use a crypto wallet. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's more and more people in the universe of crypto who know how to use a wallet, who understand the dynamics of this economy or this ecosystem, and that can be built upon. So I'm really hopeful about crypto. I think it's back. I know that right now, as we're recording this, is a little bit of a bloodbath.
Yeah.
But a year ago, I think it's still up over a year ago for me. So it's like
20,000. I think it was at like 60 last year. So yeah,
I'm like, how much of this dip can I buy?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, I think that these technologies are going to be instrumental for the social singularity. We can start to establish lateralized relationships with each other as peers, as colleagues, and what have you, that transcend the nation and yet benefit from living in a country. And I think they're going to get better, and I think they're going to get stronger, and I think they're going to learn how to push out the bad actors, the black hats, the assholes, the hackers. And in that respect, and the rug pullers, I think all those people, they're always going to be around, but more and more we're going to have better user interface and user experience. Crypto's here to stay, and it could be, we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what the next big industry is. I mentioned DeFi. It could be that the way we deal with AI competition. I'm working with a company right now that is promising in the way it causes AI and crypto to converge as industries. Let's just put it that way. Mm-hmm. I need to be quiet otherwise.
Yeah.
And so, excuse me if I'm getting tired and using a lot of ums and uhs.
No, you're good.
As I gather my thoughts, crypto is going to have to deal with a lot of baggage. Even stuff like Sam Bankman-Fried. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a centralized exchange. And once you start trying to explain to people what a centralized exchange is, they think crypto's evil because they saw something in the news about Sam Bankman-Fried. You're toast. You're not going to be able to explain all this stuff to them. Mm-hmm. It's like, but we have decentralized exchanges now. You don't need... Baby steps. But it'll happen. And it's happening slowly but surely. We're healing from the wounds of the FTX collapse and all the frauds. We're even healing from the DAO hack of 2016, 2017, which is the first Ethereum DAO. Mm-hmm. So we've got a ways to go, but there are a lot of true believers out there, and there are a lot of white hats working on it.
What does America look like in 50 years? If we properly are able to reach kind of the decentralization that we've spoken about throughout the show.
This is fun. We definitely have flying cars. I mean, I'm just going to say that right now. And Elon's going to give it to us. Okay. No, I think the 50 states are reasonable jurisdictions to be broken up. They're already broken up into counties. I think we start to see the 50 states as more like little countries. I think we have new legal frameworks that allow us to create new jurisdictions, to secede from ones that aren't working as communities, to opt into new ones, to travel between and among them. I think that the legal apparatus, we start to move closer and closer toward a condition of consent of the governed, which was the original mission, remember? And away from this idea of compulsion, of institutions based on compulsion. So if our county here our part of the county no longer wants to be a part of that part of the county, we have a right to secede or to join another county, for example. And this kind of fluid institutions mean that people and cities cohere around value, around network effects, not around the fact that they can't leave because of accidents of birth and conquest. The whole idea of the nation state kind of starts to go away in 50 years. So America as such, as it becomes more of a cultural construct where people, well, they don't talk like me because I have a bad Southern accent, but my North Carolina is showing. But that we have a lot of cultural coherence around network effects, common values, common virtues that we practice together, interest in seeing the value of community, and that this creates a positive feedback loop and set of cycles that are pro-social. That means the sort of coercive apparatus starts to dissolve a little bit. And the boundaries, while still there, you have to have membranes because you have to have the difference between our community and theirs to some degree. We may have standards and practices that they don't, and we may want to preserve those, but at least we can try them. Yes, there will be deal breakers. Yes, there will be things over which we argue and try to say we don't want anything to do with that community because they do X, Y, and Z, and we think that's wrong, and they think we're wrong. But it is though a fragile peace, a peace nevertheless. I think we're also more spiritual beings. Paradoxically, we will be more capitalist, and we will have markets in governance. We will have markets in legal institutions. We'll be able to choose from different regulatory frameworks, choose from a menu of governance structures that most closely comport with our conceptions of the good. But that will allow us to cultivate those conceptions of the good locally with people we know and love. That vision, to me, is where it's at. Yes, I think there will be fantastic and interesting ways that technology and law interconnect and we innovate law. Just like we innovate code. Law is code. Mm-hmm. Code is law. But it's really about how that gets expressed in humanity. As we become more communitarian, we create more mutual aid structures. It used to be that there was an empire of mutual aid. I use the term empire perhaps too much today, but a vast industry of mutual aid in this country where we wove the social safety net rather than outsourcing it to a distant capital. In 50 years, I see people helping their neighbors, loving their neighbors, working together, meeting in the church basements or the Freemason temple on a Wednesday night, to be together, to break bread, to solve problems, you know, to help get Sally a new wheelchair or old Jimmy a funeral because he didn't have the money. That's the vision. That we transcend all of these distractions and ascend as human beings a little bit away from the material that will be provided for in the economic substrate that we build, but that it buys us more time, and it buys us more time with each other.
Well, Max, this was an awesome conversation today, man. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. If you want to let everyone know where they can find you, and also, you know, some of the places that they can grab the book if they're interested. Quick time for a shout out.
Awesome. Well, I'm always delighted if someone, I run 2 Substacks. One is the exoteric, the kind of like politics, economics, political philosophy kind of stuff. That's called underthrow.org. But I also have a Substack called Gray Robes. The Gray Robes are a small group of people who are keen to build this empire of the mind, and that is the moral, spiritual stuff behind all this that I referred to. So whatever your listeners are interested in that I mentioned, there's going to be something in both of those for them to read, and I hope they'll join up.
Perfect, my man. I'll have those linked below. And yeah, again, it was an absolute pleasure, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.